The story begins in a pouring rain in a dark Gothic temple that seems deserted. Soon we are transported to an underground dungeon from which various sounds were heard. A few moments later, Zahid approached one of the cells, and the girl standing behind the bars jumped up in bewilderment and turned to the guy. Zahid made his way here with his last strength and turning to Rosie asked to take this sacred relic. Rosie asked in surprise what he was talking about, and the guy added that it was the temple treasure that he had stolen and which could turn back time. The girl still couldn't understand why he came here and why he was giving this relic to her instead of using it. Zahid cleared his throat and said that he didn't have divine power, so it was simply useless in his hands, but she should at least try it. Rosie answered him negatively, saying that her power was not enough to activate the relic, and she needed at least someone like a high priest. The guy wanted to answer something, but suddenly his legs began to shake and Zahid's head began to spin. A moment later, he simply collapsed to the ground exhausted, causing Rosie to scream in horror. Zahid was on his last legs, but even so he spoke to the girl, saying that he really wanted to get her out of here. When he destroyed the temple, he promised her and himself, first of all, that he would be able to free her. And yet soon his hand fell to the ground, and his last words of apology were heard for not being able to keep his word. And then complete silence. Zahid's previously heavy breathing stopped, and the only sound was Rosie's heavy breathing growing more and more panicked with each passing second. Soon tears began to flow involuntarily. Rosie turned to Zahid and asked him to open his eyes, hoping this was all a stupid joke. And still, he didn't open them, didn't react to the girl's words. A moment later, even the wolf began to howl and Rosie began to cry even harder. This is Duke Dyfenril, the master of the divine wolf, who was imprisoned along with Rosie. At the same time, he was the only last precious person she had left in this world. The girl was even more desperate because the temple literally took away another person dear to Rosie. Our heroine's name changed 3 times. Until she was 5 years old, she lived in an orphanage where she was simply called Rosie without a last name. And as soon as she manifested divine power, she was immediately sent to the temple where they began to call her Rosie Trien. Trien is the surname given to disciples with the least divine power. There were many like her in this place, so they were simple workers in the temple. But one day in the spring of her 11th year, something interesting happened. Our heroine was going about her ordinary day like any other. Suddenly, a guy approached the girl, greeted her, and introduced himself as Julian Nort. The girl was obviously surprised to hear the name Nort soon. The boy continued speaking, apologizing for the delay, as he had only just learned of her existence. Kneeling down, he explained that they had different fathers, but their mother was the daughter of Count Nort. So from that day on, Rosie was now a member of the Nort family too. Immediately, the girl began to put the picture together in her head, realizing that she had a brother whose existence she never knew existed, and it was after this that her name became Rosie Nort. Soon, Julian extended his hand, telling her that they could go together to Count Nort's estate right now. Our heroine still didn't understand whether this was really happening and whether she was dreaming because the Nort family was the richest in the empire. Rosie never imagined that she would be able to take their last name, and in fact the Nort family actively opposed the temple. But for our heroine, all these secondary things in childhood simply did not matter. What was more important was that she finally had a loving family, which made her nothing but happy. Julian hugged his little sister a moment later, telling her that she would never go through what he had gone through. All she needed was to eat well, play a lot, and be as healthy as possible like an ordinary 11-year-old child without any worries. That's all Rosie wanted. She wanted to be with the people she cared about, so she reciprocated and hugged her brother. This is how the girl followed Julian to the Nort estate. And then it turned out that her brother was truly an incredible person. From what she'd heard, he was considered the strongest among ordinary people, excluding priests and mages. Moreover, her brother was exceptionally talented in every field. He eclipsed all their relatives and became the heir to the Nort family. Of course, Rosie, as his beloved sister, received all his care and protection. Every day was filled with happiness. But as it turned out, the happiness was short-lived and couldn't last forever. Something happened that turned everyone upside down. On an ordinary day, our heroine walked into her brother's room, literally just 14 months after she received the name Rosie Nort. Julian had an accident which caused him to look at Rosie and ask in confusion who this child was. The boy, perplexed, asked if they were making fun of him because how could this girl be his sister? And indeed, Yulian had lost his memory and could no longer recognize her. For the first time, our heroine saw irritation on the face of her dear brother, the strongest Yulian, and she really was not destined to be together. The girl assumed that he was completely confused due to the loss of his memories, which is why she decided that she could no longer be a burden to him. Our heroine, due to her upbringing, always struggled with low self-esteem, so she decided to leave the mansion. But this turned out to be the biggest mistake of her life. Naturally, upon returning to the temple, the priests were perplexed as to how the student who had been living with Noart had dared to return. The inhabitants of the temple eagerly awaited this moment, and after she was locked in prison, she began to be subjected to various experiments. She remained locked away for 10 years after turning 12. During this time, her brother died, and the estate was completely destroyed. And of course, all this was the work of the temple, but even knowing this, she could not do anything about it being deep underground. And then one day, while Rosie was going through this hellish time, Zahid secretly entered the temple and found her in the dungeon. From then on, he began to risk his life to visit her, and if he had not become her friend, Rosie decided that she would not have been able to survive. But now, even he was dead, and right in front of her, leaving behind a relic that could turn back time. Looking at this stone, the girl assumed that the relic would never react to her weak divine power. And yet, in the back of her mind, a thought had formed that suggested that it was somehow possible, causing her to reach for the stone. Clutching the stone in her hands, she realized that she really wanted to turn everything back. Soon she began to turn to the stone, asking it to let her return, because it was simply terrible to realize that she was powerless in the face of the death of someone dear to her. She cried, realizing that she had been powerless all her life, but if she had one chance, she would never live like this again. Her brother, whom she cherished more than anything in the world, immediately appeared before her face. Zahid, the one who made his way into this deep dungeon just to see her. If only she could go back in time and change everything, then she would protect everyone and destroy this temple. At that very moment, the stone began to show at least some signs that there was a chance. After a couple more seconds, the magical relic began to emit bright rays, and Rosie's eyes widened in surprise. The last thing the girl noticed was the wolf, who began to growl in confusion, not understanding what was happening. A moment later, the girl fell into another space, spilling past a pile of bright fragments. And soon the action moves to a bright sunny day, to an estate over which a bright star has burst forth. At this time, a girl stood in the chambers looking at the mirror in horror, not understanding what was happening. It was Rosie who was shocked that it was all true. She really was back. Having started to look around, the girl actually discovered familiar furniture in the room, as well as personal belongings. There was no doubt that this was one of the rooms of the Noart estate. Moreover, the girl noticed a newspaper on the table which offered a chance to determine reality. As soon as she picked up the newspaper, our heroine was shocked because the date was exactly the same as 10 years ago. Rosie had no idea what had happened or how the relic could respond to her divine power. Was she really so desperate and pathetic that she decided to take pity? In any case, she leaned back, thinking that there was no point in thinking about it, because the main thing now was to focus on what would happen in the future. She understood that 10 years later, right now, she had several main tasks. The first and most obvious is to save Yulian, her older brother, who is 12 years older than her. After an accident, he lost his memory and became an ignorant village bully. This is what allowed his relatives to seize his entire fortune. Afterwards wounded, he left the estate, but for someone who was once called the strongest, being killed by a temple mercenary is too meaningless a death. The fact that Rosie is at the Noart estate right now means her brother is still alive. There's no way she'll let that happen now. The girl promised to protect him, and after that she would need to find Zahid Dyfenril. Moreover, she wanted to meet him as soon as possible in order to repay her debt to him. If she did go back 10 years, he's definitely in a tough spot right now, but they're strangers now. If she visits their mansion, they'll likely just throw her out. Still, Rosie felt sad knowing she missed him so much, but she had to wait for the right moment. And finally, the girl came to the next decision that she would have to complete. It is imperative that she protect Noart County and deal with the temple. The temple not only tortured her but also killed her most precious people in the process. The girl was confident that she would not allow them to carry out their plans, and then the county of Noart would not be able to fall. By the way, soon after Yulian's death, even their grandfather, Count Noart, passed away. After this, their illiterate relatives took control of the family, only to completely destroy it under the influence of the temple. To fight the temple, it was necessary to gain the support of the family, so it was impossible to allow these relatives to take control of everything. Rosie convinced herself she could do it, and that she was no longer trapped. In her past life, she had been too powerless, and now she refused to live that way. In any case, the girl's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Soon a maid came running in, telling her mistress that Master Julian had woken up. It was Rosie's maid, whose name was Heidi, who was very scared and couldn't say anything. The girl asked to tell her everything that happened, to which Heidi replied that Mr. Julian had partial amnesia, and his last memory was only 7 years ago. At that very moment, our heroine realized that this was the very day she left her brother alone. Julian's current mental age is not 24 but 17. The guy once told me that he had a difficult youth, and Rosie would undoubtedly be disappointed if she found out who he was. A reckless and aggressive boy who saw nothing but dark flames, complete hopelessness. The feeling of shame returned to him more and more. In other words, Julian is no longer the loving older brother our heroine knew. He's literally become a complete bully. Heidi suddenly decided to inform the lady that the gentleman probably did not remember her, but even so, she asked if Rosie would like to visit him. Rosie understood that cunning relatives were literally swarming around wanting to find a suitable chance to get rid of Julian. But if she wanted to protect him, she needed to steal her heart. The girl jumped up and, slamming her hands on the table, said she wanted to visit him. Meanwhile, the action shifts to Julian, who was trying to recover from his headache. Moreover, he also had a real brainstorming session because the doctor told him that he had lost his memories for 7 whole years, which is why he tried to analyze everything. Shulba Nodiak, Julian's assistant, told him everything was correct. He currently suffers from partial amnesia. And again the guy asked in bewilderment if everything was really as he said, to which Shulba only nodded his head. Julian was incredibly irritated, thinking that he was probably going crazy. The boy remembered that he was the only son of a poor butcher from a god-forsaken village. Not a day passed without arguments with my compulsive gambler father and my alcoholic mother. My mother was a nobleman's daughter, and my father worked as a servant for her family. After a brief affair, they had Julian and ran away here, but eventually his mother simply abandoned him and left, saying she was tired of farming. Maybe it was because he grew up in chaos and had a wild youth, but everyone in the village knew him as the butcher shop bully. But one day he woke up and realized that he had only recently turned 24. Shulba nodded, indicating that this meant Mr. Julian was the Count's grandson. As soon as he turned 19, he moved to the Count's estate and took the surname Noart. Over the next 5 years, he developed rapidly and became the strongest, and it was quite expected that he was named the heir to the county. Shulba also reminded them that they had already repeated the same information 15 times. The guy suddenly screamed in anger. He was saying that he couldn't get used to his formality. When did he start speaking to him so formally? Shulba, perplexed, said that he was no longer his friend from the village. Now he is his assistant. Their relationship is such that Julian is the employer and he is the subordinate. But taking the gentleman's hand, Shulba invited him to return to those years for a short while and talk to him as he had then, if he did not believe. The guy immediately became happy, talking about how he should become normal, because how was he supposed to believe all this? Adjusting his glasses, Shulba replied that in that case he should start. Julian soon tensed up. Within a moment, Shulba started shouting aggressively, asking him to stop asking the same question, because he was like a parrot. It was better to just take his answer. It will take Julian months to start moving normally again, and right now he's barely holding his fist back from knocking him out, so it's best not to test his patience. Shulba soon cleared his throat and asked if he should continue to, which a puzzled Julian replied that that was enough and everything was fine. Julian's assistant was incredibly happy, so he couldn't help but give him a medal of approval, saying that it was good. And yet soon after Julian's head dropped. As strange as it all sounded, he knew it was all real. And on top of that, his body was completely destroyed, which was further confirmation. A moment later, there was a knock on the door. A maid's voice could be heard on the other side of the door addressing Mr. Julian. The girl said the mistress wanted to visit him but needed permission. She asked if Rosie could come in. Shulba suddenly caught himself saying that the lady would be shocked since he hadn't had the chance to talk to her. Julian immediately wondered who Rosie was. Just at that moment, our heroine turned to Shulba, telling him that she already knew everything. It only meant that she had decided for herself that she wanted to see her brother no matter what. Julian, as soon as he heard the word brother, froze in place, beginning to analyze what he heard. It's likely that he soon had a blue screen because he woke up in horror, wondering what this girl was talking about because he didn't have a sister. The action moves back some time when Heidi was preparing Mrs. Rosie for a meeting with her brother. Putting on one of the hairpins, the maid said she'd received it as a gift from Julian for her last birthday. She figured that if he saw it, he might remember her. Our heroine looked in the mirror, asking if Heidi really thought that way. The girl smiled and nodded her head, saying that the gentleman always chose gifts for her with special care. Soon the preparations were complete, so Heidi suggested they could go. Rosie picked up a pen and said she had some things to do before meeting her brother. Our heroine immediately began writing something down. At the moment, the girl was in a good mood. Suddenly, memories came back of her brother holding her in his arms, telling her that she was his precious treasure. Smiling, he asked her to always remain as bright and confident as she was wherever she was. Finally, our heroine put the pen down on the table, thinking that she would live according to his wishes, just as he dreamed. She promised to be a person who always speaks her mind to everyone, including even her brother. As soon as the girl handed over the maid's letter, Rosie got up from her chair and said that it was time to go. And so the action moves to Julian's room, who, looking at Rosie in bewilderment, asked what this child had forgotten here. As soon as Shulba explained it to him, the boy, perplexed, asked if they were kidding. Was he really supposed to believe that this girl was his sister? Our heroine stood and looked at him with a calm face, not even showing signs that she was worried. But in her past life, she ran away as soon as she heard those words. Julian looked like a complete stranger with that cold expression on his face. And after that, she never saw him again. Rosie was locked in a dungeon for 10 years, and all those years she regretted her choice. So if she wanted to change the future, she had to do things differently this time. Approaching her brother, the girl greeted him and said she was glad to see him. Our heroine introduced herself by saying that they had different fathers, but she was still his sister. Julian couldn't believe it because she was just a little child. Soon he asked her how old she was. The girl, surprised, asked her brother if he remembered his mother running away from home when he was 12. It turned out she'd been having an affair with another man and had gotten her pregnant. Julian immediately cried out in bewilderment, asking what their mother was thinking. Now he understood why she had run away without explanation. She was born into such a family and ran away twice in the middle of the night, and what a fool even thought of telling a child that. This innocent child should never have heard such vile things. Nevertheless, our heroine responded with surprise that he'd told her all this on the very first day they met. Her mother had abandoned her in an orphanage and later died. Julian instantly turned pale, letting out a silent scream. The girl added that he was the one who brought her to this mansion. He loved her and cherished her, and most importantly, he promised to take care of her. Rosie explained to him that they were 12 years apart, and she thought it would be easier for him to remember that. The guy clutching his head said that he himself hoped that it would help, but in any case it was all nonsense. He said that he was not even able to take care of himself, and on top of that, he still had a child to raise. The guy wanted to express his dissatisfaction, but at that very moment, Shulba closed his mouth, telling the lady not to take it to her head. The gentleman's assistant said he was out of his mind and had no idea what nonsense he was spouting. Julian was simply out of his mind. Rosie laughed sheepishly, asking Shulba if it was okay to gag her boss like that, since it didn't seem like her brother would let him get away with it. With a heavy sigh, the guy let the gentleman go, saying that he was doing this only because he knew him well. But as soon as his memory returns, he will definitely go crazy and will shout something like, how dare he say something so outrageous to his beloved sister. He would also threaten Shulba with his sword, asking why he didn't shut him up. The assistant was more than sure that would be the case. Then he'd just lock himself in his bedroom and go on a hunger strike, crying all night long. Julian would be very sad about saying something stupid to his sister. At that moment, the guy shouted in bewilderment, asking Shulba what he was even talking about. The assistant instantly turned his head and looked at the gentleman with a terrifying gaze. Julian was perplexed, assuming that he had done something stupid again, and that was why everyone was looking at him so closely. And yet he still screamed, asking what he was supposed to do now. He was perplexed by the fact that he had woken up and suddenly become a count, and not just a count, but one of the most powerful in the empire. What was the meaning of this? Our heroine calmed him down, saying that there was nothing strange about it, but Yulian continued to shout, saying that he knew nothing about the aristocracy and wanted to go back to the butcher shop. While screaming, he beat the bed, saying that he had no idea what to do because his head was empty, and now he had a sister to take care of. Our heroine was truly hurt to see her brother's reaction like that right now. She couldn't have imagined such a thing before. The guy asked her if she really thought of him as some kind of arrogant lord with a rebellious streak, an immature boy possessed by a dark flame. Her once noble brother had become a village slob and she had to accept it now. The same Julian Noart, who once led the Noart family against the temple, literally vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving behind his younger, more stupid self. However, the guy soon stopped his hysteria and looked around, realizing that he had gone a bit too far. He instantly assumed he had been too harsh, causing him to cough and try to correct what he had said. However, our heroine interrupted him, saying that right now there was emptiness in his head, and he was right, he was a hopeless child, and after seeing him she was convinced of this personally. She suggested that it would be difficult for such a child to survive in Nort County, especially since his grandfather was not with them. The boys immediately fell silent. A moment later, Julian tried to somehow analyze what he had heard, but again not understanding anything, he asked what it meant at all. Our heroine approached Heidi one way or another, asking her to give the contract to the gentleman which she had prepared in advance. A moment later, the boy took the letter in his hands and began to read it carefully. As soon as he started reading this message, he was horrified because this agreement stated that he agreed to transfer all his property to Lady Rosie Noart. The guy, perplexed, asked the child what kind of nonsense this was, and did she really want him to hand over his entire fortune to her? Our heroine wasn't even going to answer his question one way or another, but simply pulled his seal out of the nightstand and put it in her hand. With a smile on her face, Rosie asked her beloved brother not to put off this contract and to put the seal right now. So it took him some more time to digest all the information. However, our heroine did not stop rushing him, saying that they did not have time. The guy was still puzzled by the fact that she was asking to hand over all her property, which made him feel that something was wrong. He immediately started shouting, asking why this little girl was already so obsessed with money. What plans did she have for this fortune? He asked everyone to take a look at her, all those jewelry and dresses she was already spending like crazy. So little, and she could already throw money around. Rosie, equally perplexed, reassured him by telling him that he'd bought her all those things. Julian was stumped again. The guy was shocked that he even managed to do this and didn't even regret it. Our heroine began to reassure him, telling him everything was fine, since she also thought he'd gone overboard buying her all this. At least they finally agreed on something. Julian soon found himself thinking, county or no county, he'd planned to return to his shop, but now he suddenly had to take responsibility for a child. This girl was drowning in luxury from head to toe. He immediately wondered, would he even be able to cope with her? Soon he turned to the child, and our heroine, perplexed, replied that she was not a child but Rosie. The boy suddenly asked her what she would do if he left the estate. He planned to abandon it and return to the butcher shop. So scratching his head, Julian invited her to go with him. Of course, this is not what our heroine would want, so she said that she had no intention of leaving this place. Julian sighed heavily, because he himself understood that it would be better for her to live in a noble mansion than in a run-down butcher shop. But he still even suggested that it would be easier for the two of them if they went their separate ways here. Looking at the seal, he decided that this would be the most logical decision he could make. At that very moment, the girl hit him over the head with the contract, asking why he was taking so long to seal it. They were in a hurry, so there was no point in sitting there and getting it sealed. Once again, the boy sighed heavily, telling the child he needed another minute. Rosie, again perplexed, said she wasn't a child. She suddenly asked if she understood correctly that he was planning to quit everything and return to the butcher shop. In any case, if it weren't for her, he wouldn't have known about his condition. The guy said that this was true, and our heroine interrupted him, asking if the infamous executioner from the shop was really just throwing around empty words, and in addition to his violations, he was also a liar. These words were like arrows, and soon the girl with a shocked face asked if he really was such a person. The guy finally lost it, started screaming and asking what the hell was going on. He replied that he'd stamp it right now. Rosie suddenly asked if he remembered that magic was required for this, otherwise the contract would be invalid. Confused, the guy said he knew asking if he looked like a liar. In just a moment, the contract was in the hands of our heroine, and she smiled with peace of mind. In turn, Yulian looked at her, wondering if she wanted to provoke him. In any case, since she's his little sister, it's all good. He'll give her everything now, but he asked her not to spend it all at once. Rosie smiled and nodded. The boy soon wondered why he felt a little bitter. From what he'd heard, he'd been a madly loving brother before the amnesia. And yet all this girl cares about is money. Was their relationship really built only on dresses and jewelry? The guy was, of course, in shock, but a moment later he began to hear approaching footsteps from outside. Naturally, he decided to inquire, asking what this strange noise was, but Shulba didn't even know the answer to this question. A moment later, bewildered guys burst into the room saying that they knew that Count Yulian had woken up. The guys immediately approached him and asked him to take care of it. They handed him the document saying that the deadline was approaching. Then another guy started talking about needing to see his document. Soon a strange battle for his attention began. Yulian had no idea what any of this was, as it was all just jargon. Yulian stared at the document and began to say that he didn't really understand it all. The guys immediately started shouting, saying that if he didn't understand anything, he should just put a seal on it. There's nothing important here, just a seal and a signature using magic. Due to the unclear and unscheduled brainstorming, Yulian began to feel unwell. Shulba noticed this and immediately began asking the uninvited guests to leave because the gentleman was in serious condition and needed rest. But the guys pushed the assistant aside, telling him to leave because they were dealing with life and death issues. One of the boys also shouted, saying that his life was on the line, so the gentleman had to put the seals. Rosie at this point addressed the enraged Shulba. The guy instantly turned around because he remembered what had just happened before those stupid guys arrived. Shulba shouted, telling the guys they were wasting their time here. Don't they know it yet? Pointing to Rosie, the gentleman's assistant said that Yulian had transferred all his rights to Lady Rosie Nort. The guys didn't believe the words, so they ran up to read the contract, which clearly stated that Yulian was transferring all his property to Rosie. This angered them beyond belief, as it wasn't part of their plan, and they began to leave. They found it laughable that a fool would give his heart and soul for a girl, and he hadn't forgotten it. Slamming the door behind him, one of them shouted that this psycho was obsessed with blood ties. Who would have thought otherwise? Meanwhile, our heroes watched this picture in bewilderment until they were left alone in the room. Shulba soon turned around and began to say that these people were not friendly. Our heroine turned around and said the situation had changed, meaning they were most likely halfway to their owners. Their documents were useless as they were addressed to Yulian. At that moment, the guy asked in surprise about the owners, to which our heroine asked, surprised where else could they go? The girl smiled and said that these were their dear relatives who had lost everything because of him. If he had sealed these documents, his fortune would have passed to them. While Yulian was perplexed by what had happened, Shulba turned to the girl and said that he was impressed, as he could not even imagine such an outcome of events. Our heroine smiled and said that these people were indeed happy about what happened, but she would never let them get everything. Yulian in turn realized that the kid was right, because he really would have simply stamped everyone in turn. At the very least, he didn't know he owned a fortune. This means that she entered into a contract with him for the transfer of property not because of greed for money, but because she foresaw everything. Shulba soon asked the lady what she intended to do since they had left, but would return with new documents and would be coming at any time of day. Would she be able to handle this? Rosie was like an angel, saying she was doing better than her brother, and the doctor said he needed rest until his body got stronger, but there was no need to worry. Rosie promised she wouldn't let those evil people get their hands on the money. Meanwhile, Yulian came to the surprising conclusion that this child had done all this for him. At that moment, our heroine turned her head and, smiling sweetly, looked at her brother, who was a little surprised. And yet soon she began to go to him, saying that they had finished one thing, but not everything yet. She suggested that they have a real conversation now since the danger had temporarily passed. Our heroine first decided to say that she was very upset for one reason. She didn't understand why this was happening to them because her heart was ready to break into pieces and her chest hurt a lot. Looking at him, she asked what she should do now. Perplexed, Yulian asked if it was too late to bring this up since it seemed like she'd already thought everything through. The girl didn't argue with this, but the situation was too difficult for her to just sit and cry. And again she said that her name was Rosie, not a child. Julian was surprised at how quickly she agreed, but he himself already realized that it was a little dangerous here. Then he decided to thank his sister for her help, but still he would leave this place later, and if she wanted, she could join him. The guy was saying that it might not be as luxurious there, but that there wouldn't be people like him there either. Our heroine kept staring at his bandaged feet the whole time. Julian was still saying something, but the girl interrupted him and asked how long it would take him to recover. Perplexed, Julian asked who she took after if she didn't listen to adults at all. Rosie, equally perplexed, replied that she took after him since he himself continued to call her whatever he wanted. With a heavy sigh, the boy replied that the doctor had suggested that he would need several months to recover, but even after that, it would be difficult for him to wield the sword. They also said that it was still unknown what was happening with his memories, but in any case it would be better if he returned to his village because he would not be able to cope with the kind of people who were here. And yet our heroine smiled at him and asked him not to worry about it, because it would not happen again. After all, he has completely lost his fortune and is now completely broke, which means he will leave with an empty pocket. The guy looked at her in bewilderment and thanked her for ruining him. Rosie smiled and said everything was fine. Someone clearly didn't get the sarcasm. And yet the girl turned to her brother saying that he had done a lot for her, so he should not thank her. And what's more, she asked him not to even think about leaving because Grandpa treasured him very much. That meant there was no safer place for him than this. The guy, perplexed, asked if she was really saying all this even after seeing those people. They were literally shoving papers in his face. Our heroine replied that they came to the mansion only with papers because he was inside, and yet if he had been outside far away from this place instead of papers, they would have had a knife in their hands. Julian couldn't believe it, dreading to even imagine what kind of person he was. Shulba in turn asked the lady how she planned to resolve this situation. After all, she's very young and so she'll still seem like easy prey to them. She's seen it herself how they'll take advantage of any opportunity their superiors give them. Our heroine turned to her brother's assistant and asked him not to worry because if they couldn't understand in words, there was another way out. She assured them that if she had to, she could use her title and put them in their place. Julian was shocked because he had seen quite a lot of strong people, but this child, there's no doubt she was too cool. The fact that she could say that and with such confidence made her even more intimidating. Soon after, our heroine turned to her brother and asked him to rest and they would see each other tomorrow. And leaning toward him, she said there was something he needed to remember. He had no relatives he could trust. The guy, naturally confused, asked what this meant, but the girl reassured him, saying that he shouldn't worry because she wouldn't let anyone hurt him. One way or another, the girl thanked her brother for waking up. She truly missed him very much. Soon after, she wished him sweet dreams and headed for the exit. Left alone, the guy simply collapsed onto the pillow, trying to digest everything that had happened to him. He didn't understand what the point was in visiting a completely broken person, and was this little girl really asking him not to worry, and that she would protect him? Julian soon turned to his assistant and asked if they were really that close. Did he really call her Little Rosie? And did he really dote on this child? Shulba nodded his head, telling the gentleman that one could even say that he almost prayed for her, so frankly speaking, he was very surprised. He hid her in his room and protected her so much that it seemed as if Mrs. Rosie was made of crystal, but when he saw how she fought back today, he was amazed at her ability. Convincing him not to leave the mansion, resolving the issue of his brother's condition, all this means that Mrs. Rosie is very smart. Julian thought at that moment, looking at the ceiling, and asked if they looked alike. At that moment, Shulba's face twisted in doubt, but he remained silent. Julian noticed this expression and, perplexed, asked what it meant. Shulba told the gentleman that his face resembled that of a wild animal, while the girl's face was the opposite. Even though they looked alike from the outside, they were completely different people. At that moment, Julian told his assistant he was right. They had the same green eyes and silver hair. Shulba was amazed at how the gentleman heard only what he wanted, and in any case, he soon realized he'd signed over all his wealth to his sister, a fool who'd give his heart and soul for her, but he still couldn't remember that. And yet how much did he love her for them to react like that? And Rosie, in the blink of an eye, had lost her loving brother. It was clear she was one step away from tears. If she cared so much about him, it must have been very painful for him, and yet he felt it nonetheless. If that was the case, Yulian wondered if he had really acted like a complete scoundrel. Does the property Yulian Noart left behind look like compensation? In any case, he had no idea of his wealth. The guy soon caught himself thinking that he could just leave everything to his sister whom he didn't even know about and be done with it. Yulian suddenly asked how rich he really was. After all, he was the heir to a count and a wealthy one at that. The boy guessed he had around 5,000 gold pieces. But if so, then this would be quite enough for a decent house on the outskirts of the capital and to live there. At this point, Shulba began to count, but warned that he could not name the exact amount at that moment. And in any case, having written down a certain number, Shulba handed over the notebook saying that this was the approximate amount of his fortune. At that very moment, Yulian almost fainted again because he simply couldn't believe there were so many. The guy screamed, asking if he really owned 1,370,000,000 gold coins. In turn, the action takes us to a slightly different place, just as the sun was rising over the castle, which meant that the maids were bringing breakfast. At that moment, two girls were walking down the hallway discussing Lord Zahid's yet another break in their engagement. Her friend wasn't particularly surprised, as it was already the fourth time. But why couldn't he just follow his family's orders? It would have been easier, but he always refused. Despite his condition, he remained just as stubborn. In any case, the girls were sure that the noise around what happened would last for a long time. At this time, the boy was lying on the huge wolf, sweating profusely. His breathing was very heavy. And yet, he assured both himself and his friend that he would endure, he would never give up. The action returns to our heroes. Heidi addressed the lady saying that these are not the best of times, but she must remain strong. The doctor said that the memories could return at any moment, which meant we had to wait patiently together. Our heroine soon nodded her head, telling the maid that she was right. By the way, this huge territory belongs to the Nort family, and they continue to live in this mansion. Despite Yulian's relatives hunting for him, this place is still the safest for them. No one would dare attack Yulian in his grandfather's estate. Rosie's maternal grandfather is the richest man in the Empire Caliban Noart. He rose from humble beginnings to amass a fortune. Thanks to marriage and money, he was able to achieve the highest possible status and became a Count A, ruthless, heartless, and highly ambitious man. But Caliban had a dark past. He was a slave at the temple and didn't really want to share it. During all the time he spent in slavery, my grandfather managed to become imbued with deep hatred and resentment towards the temple. And it is quite natural that his ultimate goal was to destroy the temple. In that case, perhaps Yulian hid her here and guarded her so carefully. Their grandfather despised the temple, yet Rosie has the blood of their priest. Yulian once said that after his research he found out that her father was a low-ranking priest who was temporarily living in the village. It was precisely because of this that our heroine understood why she was born with divine power, but sadly she was only able to inherit a very small part of it. In any case, it would have been better to keep her out of his sight, knowing his dislike of the temple. It would also have been better to avoid meeting their relatives if possible. The girl asked in surprise why and suggested they hated her too. The boy knelt down and said that this place was clearly not suitable for a child. The boy suddenly said that every one of his relatives was cunning and greedy, and that he too had had a hard time when he arrived. Rosie asked if that was really true, and he became the heir anyway. In this case, the girl came to a brilliant conclusion, telling her brother that he was even greedier and more cunning. Yulian began praising the girl, telling her she was smart. She was absolutely right. Soon after, he lowered her to the ground and began to stroke her, saying that his Rosie should never do that again. But the most important thing he definitely didn't want was for her to go through what he went through. Our heroine understood that, because she hardly saw her grandfather and relatives now that Yulian had lost his memory. They must be celebrating. However, the girl was unable to walk peacefully, because a moment later, an unfamiliar voice addressed her, ordering her to stay put. The girl turned her head, but continued listening to this strange man. He assumed she was the student, and he'd heard that her beloved brother had gone crazy. By the way, in her past life, our heroine met this same person at this time. The guy came closer and laughed, thinking that now that her butcher was in such a position, then wasn't she thinking that she should just go back to where she belonged? It was Royston Nort. As the only son of her eldest uncle, he thought he would inherit everything, but when Julian ruined his plans, his hatred for them knew no bounds. Poking the girl with his finger, he asked in bewilderment if she really thought that this butcher with the mind of a teenager would love her as much as before. Royston told Rosie to remember how much their family hated the temple and to also understand that she never belonged there. Or maybe she hoped that her grandfather would accept her into his family. Could she really belong to such a noble family? At that moment, the boy reached out to the girl, telling her to gather her things and crawl back into her hole. Our heroine tried to dodge the attack and thought about how she believed in her past life. What Royston said. No one was happy to have her here, so he won, and she simply did not resist. Our heroine began to cover herself, but Royston kept swinging his arm, asking the girl if she really wasn't going to leave. Maybe he should knock some sense into her. And yet soon the guys with the documents were very happy because they were able to find Rosie. Rosie also knew that she wasn't going to sit back and do nothing this time. Soon our heroine simply fell to the floor and began to scream, showing how much pain she was in. Royston froze in place at this turn of events. He hadn't even moved. At that moment, the boys ran even closer, perplexed, saying they needed to talk. They had something to say, and it was extremely important. Our heroine began to apologize, saying that she had simply tripped, and that she was also a little surprised, so she suggested that they talk in her room. The girl also said she didn't think she could handle the money. The robbers began to look around in confusion, and soon noticed an interesting contract. The guy immediately came closer, and taking the document in his hands, he began to study it. A moment later, he fell to the ground, asking in horror if it really said that the entire fortune had gone to her. Rosie laughed at him in her mind, saying that he shouldn't do that anymore, because now, for example, he pushed not just any ward. He should have taken someone of higher status because he pushed the owner of billions. The girl suddenly started saying that she thought she should trust everything to her uncle, but since he wasn't here, he now saw that she should reconsider her decision. Turning to Royston, she said that he had just demonstrated his uncle's morals. The guy was puzzled and asked what it meant and wanted to know more about it. Our heroine handed him the document, saying it stated that his entire fortune should go to the temple. Hadn't he just asked her to return there? The guys who came with their documents at that moment just stood there in horror, trying to understand what kind of nonsense had happened. However, the girl suddenly said she noticed that Royston was wearing Eton. It's a trend for expensive fabric. Perhaps it brings in huge profits for the temple. Realizing he has no prejudice against the temple, one can accept their devotion. But Fabric Eton doesn't. He read the news? Grandfather taught them to read the newspapers every morning. That is why our heroine assumed that Royston was an extra in their family. In any case, donating her entire fortune is a very important decision given her past. Her grandfather hated this place too much, and she needs to think it through. The girl hoped they would relay every word she said to their masters. If Royston had kept his mouth shut, the money would have truly gone to his uncle. It was scary to imagine how furious he'd be when he found out. In any case, Rosie told Royston he was right about something. She'd come from the temple, and her mother had run away of her own free will. And yet, standing over the frightened Royston, the girl assured him that she no longer considered herself worthless or insignificant. If she were like that, it would sadden her brother who loves her so much. In her past life, our heroine made a terrible mistake because she didn't value herself. She was convinced that Julian's love was lost forever. She still remembered the care and affection her brother had given her, and those memories continued to live right inside her heart. And yet, looking at Royston, the girl told him that his words would no longer hurt her. She would not repeat her mistakes. The girl screamed, saying that no matter where she came from or who she was, whether her brother remembered her or not, she wouldn't back down. Her brother had always cared for her and helped her, and now she could take care of herself. After a while, our heroine breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that she had somehow managed. Royston simply turned around and fled in terror. She had certainly managed to sort out the urgent matters, but that wasn't enough. It was still unknown what the cunning relatives might be planning for her brother's inheritance, and the only one who has enough power to protect his brother. And it doesn't matter what she thinks here, because grandfather must return as soon as possible. But the problems still won't go away. Upon learning of Yulian's accident, grandfather, who was abroad, immediately rushed to return to the empire, but a misfortune befell them too, for there was a terrible landslide on his way, and his arrival was considerably delayed. By the time he finally got back, Yulian was already dead. Rosie needed to find a way to get her grandfather back as soon as possible and earn his trust. It was the best way to increase her influence here. If Yulian were to start all over again, there would still be a chance to inherit the family fortune, and in just 5 years he was able to become so strong, which means he could do it again. Our heroine knew that until her brother took control of this situation, until they joined forces, they would not destroy the temple. Our heroine has definitely decided for herself that she will not allow anyone in this house to harm her beloved brother. After some time, the action moves to the evening, where screams are heard in one of the estates. The perplexed Father Royston shouted at him, calling him a fool, and the boy trembled with fear, saying that he could not have imagined that Yulian would give an inheritance to this parishioner. Murloc Nort, Count Nort's first son, aggressively asked his son how his whining would help. Now he'd lost all his money just because of his mouth. The man knew this butcher had at least 100 million gold in his account. He'd originally intended to entrust it all to him. Murloc soon started yelling at Royston, saying that all this boy knew was how to throw money around and how he couldn't do anything right. He told Royston to get out of there. The boy turned around and began to walk away, silently making only the sounds of crying. He was clearly upset. In turn, Murloc continued to show his character and destroy everything around him. He understood that with all this money he could pay off all his debts in just one day. And yet before his father returned, he needed to get hold of this brat's fortune as quickly as possible before his sisters and brothers got wind of it first. Immediately, Murloc turned around and shouted, telling the servant that they must delay his father's return by any means necessary. He ordered the roads to be blocked, the carriage to be broken, the carriage to be fixed, anything if necessary, even if something happened to him. He decided it would be even better this way. And again, the next day, our heroine sat in her room and read. Outside, it was a quiet and calm day. At that moment, a guy came into her room and explained to her that before Mr. Yulian lost his memory, he promised to invest money in a building, so he needed a signature. Rosie soon mentioned that she was still learning to read, so she asked the newcomer to wait a bit. The man immediately tensed up. The girl said with embarrassment that they never taught her to read in church, so there are still phrases, even many, that she does not understand. And yet, if she thought about it, she remembered her brother talking about wanting to invest the money somewhere. The guy had been tensely asking her to simply put a stamp on it. However, our heroine was tired, so she sighed heavily and turned to the guest. The girl told him that if he continued to rush her, who knows, maybe she'd put her stamp on some other document and invest in something other than his contract. The guy immediately realized that the girl wouldn't joke with him, which meant he had to do something. Rosie continued to say that this contract was difficult to read, and considering that at that very moment the guy began to apologize for disturbing her so early. He asked her to take her time and rest, and he would return another day. With these words, he ran out of the room. Finally, there was one less problem, which meant I could read the newspaper in peace. It's no wonder that just by holding it in one's hand, one could witness Duke Dyfenril's latest scandal, a broken engagement, a new wave of marriage proposals. Our heroine was still able to see him as a child and was truly happy to see Zahid. Incidentally, there are 4 ducal families in the empire. Each duke rules over a divine beast which represents water, fire, air, and earth. It's not hard to guess that among them the duke who controls the fiery beast is Zahid. For generations, the heads of these families have been born with immense divine power. Because of this, their divine beasts had to absorb and use excess mana to maintain balance. However, over the past few decades, the divine beast's power has begun to weaken. The energy had nowhere to go, they could not absorb so much of the host's mana, and this power located in their bodies began to bring hellish pain which drove them to madness. There were only 2 known ways to prevent this. One was a sedative developed by the magic tower, but the tower could no longer produce it due to the difficulty of obtaining the ingredients. Another option was to use the high priest's powerful divine power to suppress the pain. Left with no other choice, the Dyfenril family turned to the temple for help, but in exchange they demanded the divine beast. Zahid resisted to the very end, but in the end they took it. The temple imprisoned the divine beast and her, and there they began their experiments. The girl was supposed to turn this beast to her. Our heroine was lost in time considering how many experiments they were conducting, until one day Zahid was able to enter the dungeon to see his friend the divine beast. That's how they managed to get acquainted. The guy asked her how old she was and what her name was. Rosie introduced herself saying she was 12 when she was locked up here. She explained that she didn't know how long she'd been there because they were simply experimenting on her over and over again. The boy was horrified at that moment and asked again. Finally, thanks to Zahid, she realized that she was already 19 years old and had already spent 7 long years here. After this, Zahid would sneak into the prison every full moon when the divine power was at its weakest. Over the course of 3 years, they managed to talk about everything under the sun and waited for their meeting. She told her story, and he told her his about the past and present of the world beyond these walls before her return. Our heroine soon realized that at some point she had been in love with him. She never had the chance to confess to him, but deep down she knew one thing for sure. Looking into his caring eyes, looking at his reciprocity, she believed that Zahid felt the same for her. It is precisely because of everything Zahid told her about the outside world that she now knows exactly what she needs to do. A moment later, our heroine picked up the pen again and began to write something. She promised her first love and her savior Zahid that this time she would find him and become his savior. Zahid's 4th broken engagement was merely an opportunity for her. In the letter, she wrote an official declaration on her behalf, requesting an engagement to Duke Zahid. A few moments later, our heroine finally finished the letter and laid her pen on the table. In this life, she intended to be with the man she had loved since her youth. And yet, smiling, she knew that this engagement was needed now only to save Zahid, but it would be great if they fell in love with each other along the way and got married. At that very moment, Heidi appeared behind our heroine, looking at the letter with admiration and asking the lady when she learned to write so well. At that second, the girl jumped up in place, then turned her head and laughed embarrassedly. In her past life, she never learned to read while she was here. Her brother hired the best tutors for her, but none of them helped her. In the end, it was Zahid who was able to teach her to read correctly, although it took a very long time. Of course, Heidi would find this strange right now, so she had to find a way around it. Our heroine asked to keep all this a secret, because she pretends that she cannot read in order to buy time with her relatives. At that very moment, a shocked Heidi told the lady that she understood everything. She immediately concluded that she had had a plan all along. Rosie thanked her for her understanding and said she wanted to meet her brother. After some time, the girls were walking down the corridor, heading to their brother's room. However, they didn't get there peacefully because on the way they met Royston, who didn't look calm. Our heroine sighed heavily as soon as she saw that he was still wearing clothes made of Eton fabric, even though she had explained everything to him personally. It's funny that trendy things were a priority but family values weren't. It's no surprise that the temple swallowed him up immediately after his grandfather's death. What was even funnier was that the guy simply cleared his throat and pretended not to notice them, so he went on about his business. Rosie laughed, assuming he'd been scolded. After all, Heidi, surprised, asked the lady what had happened, as it had been unusually quiet. Our heroine replied that perhaps he now understands how terrible capitalism is. Thanks to her, he's growing as a person. Entering their brother's room, they noticed a huge open window through which bright sun was shining into the room. However, Julian was so deep in sleep that even the sun did not wake him. Our heroine was surprised, as she'd thought her brother would already be awake. Shulba was there too, so he was glad to see his mistress. One way or another, he asked her not to worry because he was already going to wake up the master. Rosie looked at him, surprised that despite being a close childhood friend, Shulba continued to be a professional and was by his side as an excellent assistant. The action moves to the past when the boys went out on a picnic and, as always, chatted about all sorts of things. Julian described Shulba as one of those cramming guys who never gave in to being persuaded to skip class. He was stubborn and serious to the point of impossibility. And yet, isn't it funny that this tough guy is obsessed with all sorts of cute things? He's literally crazy about adorable things. Julian proudly said that his assistant was the best in his field and that he would be loyal to the last to the people he recognized. He was also confident that he would treat Rosie well because she was his most precious treasure. Rosie understood that what her brother had said was true and that Shulba was very loyal. In his past life, he had followed his brother even after he had passed away and protected him until his death. All this meant was that our heroine could trust him, and she was truly glad that he was with her brother. At that moment, our heroine turned to Shulba and asked him to bring her brother's stamp. He nodded and said he would get it right away. As soon as Shulba left on an errand, a joyful Rosie began to walk towards her brother, saying that it was time to get up. She started tugging at him, telling him it was enough sleep. He just needed to put the seal on and go back to sleep. With great difficulty, he stood up, asking in surprise if he really had something in reserve that he should give her, but our heroine shook her head and said that this was not so. Smiling at him, she told him he was completely broke, so there was no need to worry. Yulian, perplexed, asked why that sounded more alarming than anything else. And yet, as soon as Yulian's eyes opened properly, something immediately caught his eye. Looking at his sister's brooch, he suggested that she should start buying really childish brooches, especially since this one looked very tasteless. With a heavy sigh, our heroine told him that he might be right. She wasn't particularly good at such things. But this was the first brooch he bought her, so it is valuable to her. The boy understood that he should sometimes think before speaking, and yet when he returned to bed, he said that he wanted to sleep, so he asked to let him rest. Rosie was perplexed that he was still sleepy. Anyway, she asked him to put the seal on and go back to sleep. Presenting the document, she asked for it to be forcibly sealed. This was the document in which she requested her engagement to Duke Zahid. Shulba also managed to take a quick look at this document and was immediately horrified. The boy screamed in confusion and asked the lady if she was joking. Rosie in turn turned around and said that everything was true. And still, Shulba didn't understand what was happening at all, so he tried to say this word through trembling. At that moment, he cried out in bewilderment, asking what kind of engagement this was. Yulian suddenly came to his senses. Shulba was sure Yulian would be angry later. If Mrs. Rosie even mentioned engagement, the gentleman would lose all sleep in despair for a year. Rosie joyfully assured him that her current brother wouldn't react that way. And yet Shulba was terrified, wondering what if his memory returned. Then he would go mad and eventually kill him, the innocent man who had given him the seal. Yulian immediately turned to his sister, asking if she was really plotting the engagement behind his back. How could she even talk about marriage when she was just a child? Our heroine put her hand on his shoulder and told him that he really should stop signing documents without reading them. Consider this a valuable lesson and move on. The guy screamed in disbelief, asking if she was really comforting him, even though she'd done it all herself. Rosie asked in surprise why he was getting angry when she was trying to comfort him. She asked her brother not to mention it later, saying his social skills had vanished along with his memories. Nevertheless, Shulba was tense at the time. He approached the lady, assuming that it was just a proposal, and there was no guarantee that he would agree. Since given the family's position, they had many obstacles. Well, Shulba was right about that. There were indeed obstacles. Rosie told him that given the current situation, there was a high probability he would indeed refuse. With a heavy sigh, Shulba consoled himself by saying that everything was fine and that he would still live. In any case, many families have asked the Duke for this, and for now this is just speculation. Rosie in turn asked her brother not to worry and to rest. Shortly after she was about to leave, the girl added that she would return to him for dinner. The guy looked at her in surprise and asked why she even wanted to come back. Rosie asked if he really wanted to know. He nodded his head, and our heroine answered him that she missed him and he shouldn't forget that. Meanwhile, the action takes us to a location near the Solomensky district. The boy addressed the count, saying they would soon arrive in the city where the communications center was located. There might be good news from the estate. Perhaps Yulian had already regained consciousness. However, Caliban Nort replied that it was obvious, since as the person who raised the youngest with special care, it would be better for him to wake up already. After a while, the action takes us back to our heroes who were just having lunch, and Rosie was asking her brother to open his mouth wider. She handed him a forkful of food, telling him that he shouldn't let his facial muscles tense up so much. And in general, she also decided to add words about how making a living is not so easy. Having finally chewed his food, the boy looked at the girl in surprise, asking if she had really changed her outfit again. In any case, he soon finally decided to ask her again about the engagement they'd discussed that morning. He wanted her to tell him more. The girl said there was nothing to tell them. She'd simply found someone she wanted to get engaged to and decided to propose. Shulba instantly tensed up. The boy immediately began asking the gentleman not to be nervous, as this was an offer the Duke would reject. But Julian was already angry and asked if he really was the one who had helped her with this nonsense. However, our heroine removed her brother's hand, saying that he should not threaten the assistant. She decided to remind him that he himself had said that he would return to his village. She made it sound like he didn't care about her, so she wondered why he was angry now. At that moment, the guy began to nervously try to pronounce words, but still said that he could not explain it. He felt it as if some instincts inside him were telling him to do so. They literally rejected the idea. Shulba instantly became frightened, realizing his instincts were returning. The guy was already mentally choosing a place for himself in the cemetery because if the gentleman's memory returned, then he would definitely be dead. Their little Rosie has a fiancé? What kind of nonsense is this? Shulba was sure the gentleman would go crazy when he realized everything. Julian was perplexed when he said that he could hear everything, but the assistant replied that he could no longer sincerely wish for the return of Mr. Julian's memory. The guy sighed heavily, deciding to leave it all out. He decided to ask about those strange people. He'd seen them surround Rosie yesterday, so he wondered if she'd been scared. The girl smiled and asked what was so scary. She simply kept repeating that she knew nothing and remembered nothing, and that was enough. The others don't realize that she already owns her brother's fortune, and they think that a naive child has suddenly become rich, so they don't worry about it for the most part. Julian understood that given his age and sudden wealth, they saw no threat. Rosie, for her part, is truly crazy. But despite this, she's still a child for whom 1 billion gold pieces is a huge sum. Because of this, people give her no peace. At that moment, the guy said that he had thought of something and that it would be safer to keep the money with him until she grew up, since now it was an unaffordable amount for her. He assumed she'd have a hard time dealing with it, so he offered to simply return it all to him, but our heroine was clear. She had no intention of doing that. Having stabbed a tomato with her fork, she decided to tell him that she had learned one rule at the shelter where she lived. Never trust people who tell you that they will save your money until you grow up and run away with your heels shining if they talk about investing money in a big business. She fed her brother again, and he sighed heavily, realizing the shelter had undoubtedly given her some helpful advice. Well, this wasn't going to be easy. At that moment, Rosie asked him about an idea. Looking at him, she asked if he knew what bonds and bills were. The boy tried to remember something, but his brain didn't produce any search results. Rosie immediately realized he knew nothing. When he becomes more knowledgeable and proves himself trustworthy, then she will think about returning everything. And now that no one bothers them anymore, how about some studying? The guy, perplexed, asked if they were really going to start training right away. Rosie asked if he really didn't want to. Julian replied that he'd never been stupid, and she was saying all this was too sudden. Nevertheless, our heroine approached her brother, telling him that he should at least try. Who knows, maybe he'll turn out to be an incredible genius. At that very moment, a dead silence fell over the table, and soon only the girl cleared her throat a little. With another heavy sigh, he said she'd won since he was stuck within 4 walls anyway, and had nothing to do, so he'd give it a try. Rosie was glad to hear that. Our heroine instantly became overjoyed and decided it was time to finish lunch. Meanwhile, Julian couldn't understand why he was losing his composure when she made a sad face. At that moment, Shulba turned to Mrs. Rosie, deciding to say something about money. He'd recently heard some news from the main mansion. As far as he understood, at the upcoming monthly meeting, the main topic would be her inheritance, since the amount was too large, and the issue of a decision on her condition would be considered. Our heroine nodded and said she understood. She had expected that, though. The Noart family holds a monthly meeting to discuss important matters. At the next meeting, the relatives will resort to all sorts of tricks to seize their wealth. Considering that Grandpa isn't here, it will be difficult to resist them. Julian shouted in bewilderment and asked why it was up to the elders to decide. Rosie replied that they wanted to take the money until she came of age, invest some of it in a major project, and split it between them. Julian was incredibly angry because it was his money. Our heroine calmly told him not to worry, as she had a plan. All he needed to do now was focus on his recovery. She also decided to clarify something else. After wiping the food from his mouth, she reminded him that it wasn't his money, but hers. She smiled and said she'd take good care of them and return them, multiplying them several times over. Yulian, perplexed, said it was a scam she'd learned about from the shelter. A short time later, they arrived at the estate. Shulba approached Rosie, asking if she had called him. Rosie replied that when her brother had woken up, she wanted to know if he had sent a letter to his grandfather. The boy nodded his head and said that they were planning to send a letter through the communication center in the region. The Count must be very worried about the young master. In this case, our heroine decided that soon her grandfather would be in Solom, and after that, he would set off on his journey through Tefan. Tefan is the place where in a past life my grandfather encountered a landslide, but in order for my grandfather to return quickly, his path had to be changed. Our heroine handed over another folded letter and asked that it be attached to the letter for her grandfather. Yulian asked again. Assuming he was talking about the Count, Rosie nodded and asked that the relatives not know anything. They had to pretend he was talking about Yulian's condition. In the same way, she decided to add that he could read this message now. In the letter, our heroine addressed her grandfather, saying that she would like to ask him for something. On the way back, she asked him to create a shell bracelet for her, which she really wanted. She said that she would pay any price for such a gift, and yet she looked forward to his return. At that moment, Shulba asked in surprise about the shell bracelet. He clearly remembered that it had been the Count's very first business venture back when he was a sailor. Rosie replied that it was true. The seashell bracelet he'd made was her grandfather's very first business venture. This meant he would never ignore her request. And yet the boy was confused. He asked why she was asking him for such a thing since he didn't understand her intentions at all. Our heroine told him that was the point. She didn't want him to understand Rosie in order to interest her grandfather, decided she needed to spark his curiosity. In parallel to this, somewhere in the future, Caliban finally received this letter from the servant. Nevertheless, Shulba still asked the lady what she meant. The girl explained that this letter would only be the beginning. She smiled and asked the assistant to watch, saying that soon she would make sure that her grandfather noticed her. Soon the action really does move to Solom, where the sun was already setting below the horizon. At this time, Caliban finally received that very letter and soon realized that his brat Yulian had already woken up. And yet, on top of everything else, he had serious injuries and also partial amnesia. At that moment, the man also noticed another letter lying just below. Asking what it was, the assistant replied that it was from Lady Rosie. Caliban was surprised by this, since he'd only seen her once and from a distance at that, what business could she possibly have with him? Yulian was always too protective of her, even hiding her in the back wing and not even introducing her to his family. The guy said that she was a former student from the temple, and was he really afraid that this would make him hate her? And yet, judging by everything he'd heard, she hadn't even come to the temple of her own free will. Yulian probably really did assume his grandfather was that unreasonable. And yet if he doesn't come to his senses by the time he arrives, he'll shout right in his ear that Rosie cut herself on a paper. His eyes will instantly turn into nickels. And then, joyfully picking up the letter from the girl, he expected his grandson to jump up and scream in despair. Right? The assistant smiled sheepishly and nodded. However, he soon began to read the letter sent from Rosie and soon cried out. The assistant asked what had happened, and Caliban responded by saying they were changing the route immediately. The guy, perplexed, asked what that meant. He couldn't understand whether she was changing her route simply because of a request from a granddaughter he'd only seen once. However, the Count said it wasn't a request since she wanted to buy it. She wrote that she would pay any price. Soon the man asked his assistant if he knew the principle he followed in business. Whoever it was, he'd never turn down a desperate deal. Rising from the table, the man said he'd understand later what he meant. Better to take a risk than to regret a missed opportunity. And what's more, if his granddaughter was willing to pay any price, the question immediately arose. How could he refuse? He ordered everyone to get ready and leave immediately. The action moves to the Noart estate, where at such a late hour Shulba was not sleeping, but only looking at the storm outside the window. But suddenly he heard the voice of Mr. Yulian. The young man walked along perplexed, asking Shulba how he could have given him the seal so easily. The man, horrified, explained that he himself had ordered the lady to be harassed at her every whim. However, having started to take out his blade, the master ordered him to shut up and stop making excuses. The guy looked at his assistant with a crazy look, telling him that anyone who touches Rosie will pay for it. A moment later, the guy woke up in a cold sweat, and fortunately, he immediately realized that it was all a dream. With great difficulty, he managed to fall asleep, and the next morning he was already walking with his tea, thinking about why Mrs. Rosie had so suddenly started demanding this engagement. As far as he knew, she had no connection to this duke, and yet the letter said that whether they agreed or not, they had something in store. The plan was that they could give an amount that they could double if they wished. After some thought, Shulba guessed that she was trying to use this marriage to strengthen the bond between the families in order to protect Yulian. And yet marriage with Duke Dyfenril was becoming less terrible in appearance. If everything went smoothly, then the Count himself would give his consent. After all, the Noart family of counts with a short history and the long-existing Duchy of Dyfenril. Although both families belong to a noble family, their positions are not on the same level. For example, a large noble conference which can only be attended by 4 ducal houses. For many years, Count Nort's main goal was to attend this gathering, but no matter how hard he tried, the impenetrable wall of primogeniture always stood in his way. But at the same time, if Rosie becomes Dyfenril's bride, then Count Noart, who has taken the place of the Duke, would be able to take part in this great noble conference. And of course, with the young Duke Dyfenril, who, according to rumors, fights magical atrocities. According to the family's internal law, if the Duke is absent, the bride's family assumes considerable authority. This would give the Noart family considerable power and influence. Remembering Rosie's words about trying to attract her grandfather's attention, Shulba understood that the lady was so young but was already going to great lengths to protect her brother. He always thought that she was just a harmless, adorable, and gentle child, but in fact she is really very smart and thoughtful. Although if you think about it, he couldn't even know this because due to the excessive protection from Yulian, she couldn't show all her abilities. To be honest, when he realized that Yulian had returned to the age of a 17-year-old slob, he felt hopeless. But he didn't expect that Mrs. Rosie would dare to do such a thing. Soon the boy finally reached Yulian's room, and without even entering, he realized that the brother and sister were already talking there. Perplexed, Yulian asked his sister if she cared too much about her appearance. After all, the most important thing in a person is the soul. Looking at her, he could literally tell she changed her outfits and accessories several times a day. This wasn't a fashion show. However, Rosie decided to change the subject by asking her brother if he was doing well in school. At that moment, the boy began to say that he really did seem like a genius. He instantly memorized everything just by flipping through pages. Was he destined to become a great scientist? He never realized his talent, so he didn't study as a child from now on. If she had any questions, she could rush to him. Shulba couldn't understand when he became so smug. However, Yulian soon said that even the doctor said that the speed of his recovery is no joke, and if everything goes well, then today he could sit in a wheelchair. They say if the Mage Tower finds out how quickly he's recovering, they'll want to take him in. Apparently his resilience has become equal to that of the Holy Knights. Rosie was surprised that his childhood dream was to become a test subject in the Mage Tower, but she would still support him. Yulian in turn was surprised that most children didn't want to become holy knights. At that moment, Shulba looked at the gentleman thinking that outwardly he still seemed grumpy, but in reality, Yulian began to look forward to meeting his sister. Even before his memory loss, he still found time for tea despite his busy schedule. He said it was his rarest treat. In turn, the girl gave him cookies, asked him to eat them, and go to work. He was so annoying. Yulian spoke with admiration of Rosie's gift to him. He addressed the entire world, asking everyone to admire this beauty. It was so delightful. And yet Shulba sighed heavily because he understood what would happen when his memory returned. He'll probably cry for a month just remembering how Rosie used to feed him food. Meanwhile, the action shifts to Murloc, who was reading a news report with a headline that read, "A great landslide has hit Tifon." The man laughed and was incredibly pleased with himself. Heaven favors them as they will accomplish their plan. The assistant soon reported that the roads were blocked and the communications center had been down for a long time, but they hadn't received any messages. Does that mean the Count is out there somewhere now? He assumed he might be in serious trouble, and Murloc was only too happy about it, but still his father wasn't the type to give up so easily. He'd be back no matter what. But still having thrown the newspaper on the table, the man was sure that he would definitely not have time to return to their large, noble gathering. They will hope that he will stay longer, for he must strip this apprentice and this worthless butcher of everything they have and repay them for all their suffering. Murlock also decided that before his father returned, he would have to get rid of them forever. Even if he returned to the Empire, he would never see them again. The action shifts back to the Noart estate. Heidi suddenly approaches Shulba. Or maybe not suddenly. The guy remembered that Rosie told him that she would send Heidi for him this evening. He would need to go to her room, but in such a way that no one would notice. As he walked down the corridors, the boy wondered, what had the mistress come up with this time? Soon Shulba came into Mr. Yulian's room, saying that he needed to go to Lady Rosie about the matter they had discussed. The guy, surprised, asked why she'd called him instead of him. Shulba suggested she might be worried about him, worried the journey to the bedroom wouldn't be easy. However, Yulian sighed heavily and agreed to this since Rosie didn't yet know that he could move with this miracle of technology. The doctor recently told him that he knew Yulian was strong, but his recovery speed was just too incredible. He's the coolest patient he's ever had. Yulian spoke proudly about it, but wondered if his sister didn't think he could recover so quickly. Turning his head, he asked if they were coming. Shulba asked in surprise. Yulian assumed they'd already finished reading the book, and now was the time to show his sister what a genius he was. She'd always been eager to see him, and now he'd come himself, especially with such an invention. Shulba kept his composure and said that such unexpected visits were not welcome. However, Yulian said that Shulba was starting to get tiresome, so they should go, and the young blacksmith should obey the genius butcher. Shulba tried to control himself so as not to do something stupid, but still this reckless butcher's spawn was too unbearable. At this time, our heroine was in her room and taking off her earrings. These words that her brother said were surprising, because he attacked her, saying that she changes her earrings every hour. Rosie sighed heavily because that didn't work either. Her brother had chosen these earrings himself from a jeweler who had visited the estate. The gentleman himself had given her this jewelry for her last birthday, and if he saw her in it, perhaps he would suddenly remember her. These were Heidi's words that Rosie was thinking about. It was precisely after these words that our heroine changed her jewelry and clothes for every meeting with her brother. However, each time he said some not very pleasant words, for example, he offered to buy a really childish brooch. Looking at her images, he assumed that she wanted to become a chameleon because she changed her dress once again. Soon he even came to the conclusion that his little sister was too fixated on her appearance. Like Heidi said, maybe if he sees the things he gave her, his memory will come back. Our heroine had no intention of giving up. She wanted to continue clinging to even this tiny bit of hope. Rosie wanted to help her brother because his words never left her head. He often talked about how neither of them had been lucky enough to have parents. And yet instead he offered to be each other's ray of light. He offered to cherish and care for each other, to become the only true allies in this world. But our heroine, surprised, said he didn't need her protection since he was 12 years older than her. Yulian in turn replied that he would also age 12 years sooner. The boy laughed, saying that when he really got old, she'd have to push his stroller. Rosie looked at him sadly and asked why he was talking about such things. After picking a flower, Yulian said that this happens to everyone sooner or later. So what difference does it make? Sometimes he thinks about it and realizes it's not so bad. At least when he retires, he'll have plenty of free time. Just imagine how wonderful it will be when the day comes when they can have 2 meals a day. Rosie was both happy and sad. But sadder still because her brother was always busy. Shulba would come running right during their walk, saying it was time to go home. Often the assistant would remind him of his busy schedule, which would prompt Yulian to immediately apologize and offer to at least have dinner together since he needed to work. And yet the action takes us to the night when they were supposed to have dinner, although Rosie was waiting for him for another hour on top. Eventually, Yulian never came to her, and all the food simply grew cold. Rosie began eating closer to nightfall, knowing her brother wouldn't come, and everything was already cold and tasteless. Having dinner or lunch together is something ordinary, but this only happened after he lost his memory. The action takes us to our heroine's room, where she sits at a table and reads upon entering. Yulian assumed she was practicing her reading. The girl answered him that she was a slow learner, but Yulian said that there was no need to rush because the tutor told him that she was very talented but had problems with reading. Our heroine assured him they'd say anything if he paid them. But what if she didn't rush and soon became stupid? Julian replied that he too had started studying late. He talked about how difficult it had been for him, but he'd managed it. Rosie was delighted. Soon she asked if that was really true. Julian nodded his head and soon said he couldn't wait to read a book with his Rosie. It was his second biggest dream. But still, the first thing he asked her to do was not put pressure on herself because it wasn't worth it. No matter what happened, no matter what she was like, he would still love her. Rosie asked in surprise if he would really love her even when she was over 70 and still hadn't learned to read. Her brother nodded in surprise but still advised her to try to learn before she turned 60. With a heavy sigh, our heroine told him that just like that, in the blink of an eye, his love had faded away. At that very second, the guy fell to the ground, starting to apologize and say that he was wrong. He promised her that even if she was already 72 and still had not learned to read and write, he would still love and protect her. At that moment, tears began to drip onto the earrings that Julian had given his sister. The girl proudly spoke of how she could now read. Of course, even if he didn't remember that she couldn't before. Suddenly, Royston appeared in her head, arrogantly asking if she really thought a 17-year-old butcher could love a worthless thing like her. The tears did not stop flowing, but our heroine caught herself thinking that she could not allow herself to give up and doubt. She was sure that her brother would definitely be able to love her again because she loved him. No matter the situation, no matter who she becomes in the end, Julian will love her because he promised. But even if not, Rosie will continue to love him herself and show it. As soon as our heroine opened the box, her face changed. She was surprised. Looking at the chest filled with jewels, she wondered, had there always been so many of them? Taking the photograph in her hands, the girl asked what she should choose for tomorrow. And yet she caught herself thinking that she should be grateful just for the fact that he survived. She'd asked him not to buy so much after all, so how was she supposed to choose between all of this? She'd thought it would be enough to just stay close and protect his life. She kept telling herself that it didn't matter whether he remembered her or not. But of course, she couldn't calm down at that moment because the thought that she could lose her brother who loved her worried her too much. For some time, our heroine simply continued to sit on the floor and cry, saying something to herself. But she forgot that she had guests planned who at that very moment were approaching the door. Opening the door slightly, Julian saw and heard Rosie crying, saying something about her beloved brother. After some time, our heroine thanked Shulba for coming. At that moment, the guy hoped that Julian had arrived without any incidents, because right in front of the ladies' room he had said that he needed to go back. Rosie, for her part, decided to get down to business, starting with Julian's property. Shulba asked him to destroy everything starting tomorrow. The boy exclaimed in confusion, asking why she had decided to do this so suddenly. Rosie said he understood correctly, and that they needed to place everything in the magic stones before the meeting. The newspaper headline read, "An announcement from the temple. Many hadn't expected such a scale from the Romor mines." The magic tower was in crisis. Stone prices continued to fall. Sighing, Shulba said that he understood everything and understood that she would prefer to dissolve everything into thin air than give even a drop to her relatives. However, then she will bear full responsibility for the loss of money. When it comes to money, their self-interest will never end. Our heroine in turn was serious, so she said that she knew all this and they were obliged to do it. Looking at her, he remembered the words of the gentleman who said that if she wanted something, he would follow her to the end, and if he was not there, he asked her to stay by her side. Sighing, the guy said that he understood everything, which meant he would take care of everything. Soon after, he said goodbye to Rosie and headed for the exit as it was late. Our heroine, in turn, was thinking that the meeting was already a week away. If her grandfather had received her letter, he should have arrived just in time. Standing in front of the window, she thought, realizing that she needed to hold out a little longer until the monthly meeting, and so the days began to fly by. The uninvited guests continued to ask her to sign their documents, but the girl wriggled out of it. The days with her brother were also full and good, at least Rosie thought so. Julian, for his part, wasn't so happy for some reason. But the same cannot be said about Murlock, who happily read the news every day and reveled in thoughts of his imminent victory. One day a doctor came to Julian and gave him crutches so that he could walk on them. The action also shifts to Zahid, who was not feeling well, and yet his beast was by his side. And now finally, the day long awaited by the relatives of the Noart family has arrived. At this time, Murloc looked at the throne, thinking that everything happened as they expected, because his father was unable to return in time. This arrogant girl didn't want to give up the money until the very end, so there was only one way out. They had to stick to the plan they'd already agreed upon. Next to Murloc sat his second son, Felide. He hoped they had agreed to divide the inheritance between them. The second daughter, Monica, also hoped that her older brother had not forgotten about their agreement. Who cares how they treat this immature girl? After all, her father hates the temple. These kids will soon be penniless and then thrown out of here. Looking at the girl, they assumed that she was probably trembling all over with fear at this meeting. Our heroine, for her part, had no intention of showing weakness. Entering, she introduced herself and asked for their understanding, as this was her first time attending a meeting. This certainly took Murloc by surprise, as he thought she wouldn't be able to handle the atmosphere like any child, but she was calm. Had she really been playing dumb all this time to buy time, wanting to stop them from doing anything before the important meeting? But still, he decided that even if this were the case, it wouldn't change anything, because everything had already been decided. At that moment, the man smiled with a crazy look and said that if everyone was here, it was time to start the meeting. Without thinking twice, he decided to start with the first agenda, which was quite interesting. In a calm voice, the man said that from what he had heard, Julian had transferred all his property to Lady Rosie, his younger sister. The fortune belongs to the Noart family, and the amount is too large for just one child, and as long as the money is under their name, they cannot have such a sum scattered around the world. Therefore they, the elders of the family, will take care of the property properly, invest the money in the right business, and as soon as she becomes an adult, they will return everything back. And again, there were those phrases. She had expected it, of course, but it was still unexpected. Nevertheless, it was time to listen to her relatives' opinions. The decision had to be made by vote, so the man said that those who were for should raise their hand. In turn, our heroine replied that there was no need for this since there was no more money. She said that she had invested her entire fortune in magic stones, so there was no need to discuss it. Murloc definitely didn't expect this turn of events, which is why he even froze in place. Monica immediately jumped up and asked the girl if she was crazy, considering the price of stones kept falling every day. Felide had no idea what was going on. She explained that a mine with a large supply of stones had been discovered near the temple, which is why they were falling. Romor is much cheaper and more effective than these magical stones. Felide now screamed in horror, assuming she'd lost her mind. Monica said she didn't know much about investments, but investing all her money at once was crazy. Rosie in turn replied that she had already said that she would invest money in the business that her brother would like to invest in, and suddenly she remembered that he had once told her about these stones. Our heroine didn't understand why they were so angry because in any case it wasn't their money. Meanwhile, Murloc was truly out of his mind and was incredibly angry at this little girl who was ruining their lives. The man started walking towards her thinking that he had been too lenient towards her just because she was a child. And yet during this time she managed to pull off such a trick to fool them. At that very moment, he hovered over the little girl about to hit her. Our heroine cowered in horror, but help came from an unexpected source as a stone instantly hit Murloc's head. The man, perplexed, began to say bad words and asked what that was all about. However, a voice soon came from the door. The boy, perplexed, asked if his uncle really was that kind of person. He asked in bewilderment if he really dared to raise his hand against a young child. Monica and Felide tensed up at that moment. At this time, Julian stood in the passageway holding a slingshot and asking if his uncle wanted to get hit in the head again. The action soon takes us back an hour when the doctor just came to see Julian. Looking at Julian, he said it was truly the first time he'd seen such a rapid recovery. He was undoubtedly born with a strong body. At first, he didn't even pay attention to his recommendations, but he takes his medication regularly and doesn't neglect his rehabilitation. Julian proudly said he tried. But why does he say that? The doctor replied that at this rate, he'll be back to normal life very soon. It's impressive how quickly he got out of the wheelchair. At that moment, the guy thought about how he hadn't even been able to show this chair to his sister that day, or for that matter, on any other day. While the doctor admired Julian's recovery rates, the boy walked around the room not understanding what was wrong with this child. She smiled so radiantly in front of him, but in the end, she shed tears because of him. The whole problem was that he simply couldn't remember what had happened all this time. The boy wondered why she was crying so desperately and blamed himself for it. It was too bitter. Just at that moment, he noticed that Shulba was starting to set the table, but, glancing at the chair, he noticed that Rosie's seat was empty. Now that he thought about it, Grandpa said he wouldn't be able to attend the meeting. Shulba sighed heavily and told the gentleman he was right. Perplexed, Yulian asked his assistant why he was so gloomy today. The guy replied that he was simply worried because at the meeting, the relatives would definitely try to take possession of the lady's property. The problem was the Count wasn't here, so how would she manage everything alone? And when word got out that the stone she'd invested everything in was losing its value, while Shulba was grieving over what was happening and his own thoughts, Yulian felt guilty. He realized that a girl who looked no older than 9 years old would be present at such a dangerous meeting. The guy soon decided that he couldn't let it go because it really bothered him. Rosie really makes him worry, especially when she smiles and then cries bitterly. When he first heard he had a sister, everything was different. There was only a sense of responsibility. But at the same time, she constantly came to him. She constantly lifted his spirits and asked how he was feeling. Coming to him for every lunch and dinner, she asked if his food was tasty or if maybe something was wrong. And even more so, the moment when she said she missed him and wanted to see him more often, Yulian couldn't understand why she was acting like that towards him. Sighing heavily, Yulian soon asked if he remembered correctly that only members of the Noart family could attend the meeting. The guy, confused, asked what this meant, and Yulian replied that he was the same Noart and had enough rights to attend this meeting. That's how he got to this meeting. Incidentally, right now he was laughing, saying that it turns out he's good at shooting a slingshot. And yet he was famous on his street, especially when it came to hitting birds. He never missed. Anyway, taking his sister by the hands, Yulian said in bewilderment that this little girl had not said anything bad. Addressing the elders, he asked why they were all making such a fuss. He decided to remind them that the money was his, not theirs. Murloc was perplexed at this moment because he heard that Yulian lost his memory, but he always dressed well and looked like he was brand new, so why was he so disheveled now? At that moment, Yulian mentioned that Shulba was beside himself. How could this child have ended up here alone in such a terrible place? Murloc, perplexed, began to ask Yulian if he was serious about saying all this. However, he ordered them to shut their mouths, listen, and also to stop bothering this innocent creature. If they're going to make a fuss, they'd better attack him since he was the one who invested the money. But if they touch his sister again, they won't get off easy. At that very moment, the perplexed relatives began to look at each other, realizing that something needed to be done. Monica stood up at this point and drew attention to herself, saying that something needed to be clarified. However, looking at this strange woman with an angry look, Yulian asked who it was anyway. Rosie told him it was their aunt. The boy, surprised, said her eyes were literally filled with poison, to which his sister responded that there was no other way to survive in this place. Monica, however, heard them perfectly well at that moment, but decided to ignore them. They were talking about Yulian's punishment after all the elders had already seen everything. She accused him of bringing a weapon into the hall, and this action is against the rules. To make matters worse, he wounded a member of the council with it, which could have resulted in serious injury. Yulian was also becoming more aggressive, so he asked if they even knew about his skills. However, Murloc came to his senses and decided to support his sister, agreeing with her that bringing weapons to the meeting is strictly prohibited. Coming closer, he told Yulian that he understood he'd lost his memory, but rules were rules. This was a fair rule for the meeting, and it couldn't be broken. That's why, as punishment, he'll be forced to live in the southern villa. For a month, they'll rest and recuperate in the fresh air. Our heroine became very scared at that very moment because this was not what she wanted. She couldn't believe it because she tried too hard to make her brother stay here. But if he leaves the estate now, she doesn't even know when he'll die. Even in his past life, when her brother left this estate, he died. However, noticing that his sister was not feeling well, Yulian put his hand on hers. Murloc laughed, saying that was a great idea too, since he could take Rosie with him. After all, she was his beloved little sister whom he treasured so much. Soon the man approached his relatives, asking what they thought. Everyone was perplexed, as having a weapon in a meeting room was completely absurd. People were shouting and saying that this was all a disciplinary matter, bringing a weapon into the sacred meeting room. He should be punished for breaking the rules. Naturally, everyone agreed, and that meant only one thing: a victory for the relatives. And yet it was only a battle, not a war. The man then said that they must submit and accept the punishment that was given to them. It was only at that very moment that a loud knock was heard at the door, along with a bewildered voice that spoke of how pathetic everything was. The man angrily asked how a simple slingshot had ever caused so much trouble and noise. Murloc turned around instantly. The problem was that voice was his father's. Caliban Noart had finally returned home. As he began to advance, the man decided to remind them that their main goal was to destroy the temple. They must be vigilant and on guard against any threat that might arise. And even after that, they go crazy over a slingshot as if it were a deadly weapon and demand punishment. Caliban angrily asked if they weren't ashamed of themselves. Murloc began to stutter, saying that he had come after all, but why hadn't he warned? In his head, he had no idea how he had returned so quickly. Caliban, perplexed, asked if he'd really hoped he wouldn't return. Murloc began by saying he'd simply heard there'd been a landslide on the way back. The man screamed, asking if they really thought a landslide would stop him from returning. He was the kind of man who braved even natural disasters to achieve his goal. He then said that he arrived by boat, and although it was a little inconvenient thanks to it, he was able to avoid the landslide and arrived faster than expected. Soon he reached into his pocket, saying that a businessman would never miss a chance to make an interesting deal. That is why, having handed over the envelope, Caliban turned to Rosie and said that he accepted her offer. Our heroine bowed and thanked her grandfather for this because it means a lot to her. A bracelet made of seashells, grandfather's business acumen, was evident even in such a small detail. Her letter, this specific instruction, forced him to fulfill Rosie's request with the same conditions as before. He went to the coast to collect shells. The sea route was a logical and natural choice. Getting there any other way would have taken even longer. Our heroine finally smiled, saying that she had never seen the real sea, which is why this shell bracelet was so important to her. The man replied that this bracelet was made by his own hands, and he spent time and also put in a lot of effort, and his time is very valuable. Caliban looked at his granddaughter and asked how he planned to pay her, because what if he thought her price was too low for the bracelet? Our heroine understood that no matter what amount he set, she was obliged to pay a decent price to satisfy him. As expected, her grandfather's words caught her attention. Right now, the most powerful force in the empire was the temple. Even the royal family and the 4 ducal houses literally could not resist them. And the Noart family managed to choose just such a powerful enemy, a family that is in danger because of its opposition to the temple. That's why, when a grandfather evaluates the abilities of his offspring, the skill he values most is the ability to respond to a crisis, in other words, adaptability. The girl suddenly said that a few days ago she proposed marriage to Duke Dyfenril, and if everything goes well, she is sure that this marriage will be an advantage for her grandfather. At that moment, a dead silence fell over the room and only one question rang out. What does the proposal mean? A second later he screamed, asking the question again. Surely he wasn't a merchant who would give away his granddaughter like that, and this was the worthy price she had prepared for him. If Yulian's memory returned, he'd collapse in shock again. Her brother had raised her as his most precious treasure, and she'd simply decided to sell herself. Yulian could already tell his grandfather was in complete shock. Rosie was a little surprised, not expecting such a reaction, but that wasn't the end of it. She said that if he didn't like the price, he'd offer another. The man asked, surprised, what other price could there be? Rosie simply had to prove her ability to handle crisis situations. Our heroine suddenly said that her grandfather chose the sea route after reading her letter, as a result of which they avoided a landslide and saved a lot of time. Rosie soon asked if this was not a reasonable price, since, as he had said, his time was valuable. Rosie understood that no one can predict natural disasters, and now her grandfather recognizes in her actions not a coincidence but a conscious ability to think ahead. Once her offer didn't work, she immediately took the opportunity to propose a different deal. Our heroine was sure that if this worked, then she would definitely. At that very second, Caliban began to laugh loudly. Trying to stop his laughter, the man turned to Yulian, asking why he had hidden such talent all this time. Yulian looked around in confusion and asked if he was talking about him. Rosie, for her part, assumed everything was fine. However, Murloc intervened in the conversation and said that the child had spent 137 billion on stones, wasting all her property. At that moment, the man asked the amount again and was surprised because it couldn't possibly belong to her. Wasn't that Yulian's fortune? The man said that was true, but it was still their family's money and she threw it away. At that point, Royston decided to join the conversation. The boy begged his grandfather to be reasonable because Rosie was a native of the temple, and if so, she even possessed sacred powers. How could they possibly trust her? Everyone immediately started talking about how Rosie could very well be a temple spy, the viper at the center of their family. What if she'd thrown all their family's money away to support the temple? Yulian cried out in confusion and asked why it was Nort's money, since it was his money after all and he'd given it to his sister. Royston suddenly realized that Yulian was actually helping her. After this, Royston also decided to add and asked to note that he treated with particular cruelty. Who knows, maybe this slingshot isn't just some toy but a real weapon from the temple. Yulian tried to control himself, and yet, jumping up, he shouted that if the temple had supplied such slingshots as weapons, it would have gone bankrupt and started begging long ago. What kind of nonsense was he talking? Rosie was surprised that her relatives planned to use her origins against her in this way. But what's even funnier is that now these nasty people want to drag her brother into this whole situation. It was precisely for this reason that her brother had once hidden her away from their sight among such greedy and cunning people. Our heroine couldn't even imagine how 19-year-old Yulian managed to survive in this estate alone. It was scary to imagine what he had to go through over all those years before he became strong enough. Most likely things were so bad that it got to the point where he didn't even allow her to see these people. And yet our heroine decided she would survive. This snake den wouldn't break her and she would endure. Rosie suddenly swore that she and her brother had no loyalty to the temple. Moreover, she said he could use his discerning eyes and see everything. The truth would become obvious. He needed to concentrate and gather his courage. The girl soon turned to Royston. She had to calculate everything, develop a strategy. Every interaction was a carefully thought-out move. Rosie asked to give the slingshot to her grandfather so he could look at it. Yulian had managed to survive and crush all his opponents. She would do the same. She would rise and triumph. Already at this moment, the guy became a little tense, so he stepped back and asked what she was talking about. Rosie sighed heavily, wondering if he could even do that. What a timid boy. He was perplexed by the fact that she called him timid, so he abruptly walked up to his grandfather and asked him to take the weapon. He looked at him and said that he shouldn't trust anything connected to the temple, but Caliban's gaze was far from the thing Royston was holding. The guy was saying that even if he doesn't succeed now after conducting an investigation, he is confident that. However, at that very second, the man screamed, grabbing the boy's hand and saying that he was a fool. The man shouted in disbelief. How dare he appear before his eyes in Aten clothes? Who is indirectly helping the temple right now? Rosie laughed to herself because she had warned this idiot at their first meeting. He probably didn't expect his grandfather to return so suddenly, which is why he didn't change his Aten outfit. Because she provoked him, he completely forgot what he was wearing, so he did something stupid. Still, there was one thing he had to remember, because she wouldn't let anyone who touched them go unpunished. After some time, the guy was walking to his place in tears because he didn't expect this in front of all his relatives. Caliban in turn turned his head and looked at his granddaughter, wondering, had she done this on purpose? She forced Royston to approach him and made sure he noticed his attire. She used payment as an excuse to show off her courage and how she put her cousin in his place. The man smiled because this was quite interesting, and he clearly did not expect this from his granddaughter. Anyway, he soon started shouting that they should stop their pointless talk and realized that whether it was a couple of billions or trillions of gold, that was all the wealth of Noart. From now on, he ordered not to even raise this issue or think about it, otherwise they would meet with him personally. After that, he wanted to leave to rest, but finally turned to Rosie. From now on, he ordered her to attend the morning meals of the whole family. Yulian could already walk, so it was worth it for him to be present too. Our heroine was only too happy about this, so she nodded her head with a smile on her face. After that, the meeting was adjourned. Rosie understood that her grandfather had finally acknowledged her since she had joined the family's morning meetings. At that moment, Yulian turned his head and asked his sister if there would be a meeting next month. The girl hesitated, but assumed there most likely would be one. In that case, he suggested going together next time. He really doesn't care how his little one spends the money, so why does it bother them so much? Our heroine was very surprised at this moment because she realized that from the very beginning he had called her little one, but Yulian continued to be perplexed, even saying that whether it was gambling with magic stones or a casino, what did they have to do with this? Our heroine soon told him that he shouldn't gamble as he'd end up like his father. Yulian replied that she'd told him this before. Nevertheless, our heroine asked in surprise how he knew this, and yet Yulian's father wasn't all that great. His father was a gambler who lost his entire fortune. Soon the guy turned to her saying that he of course had no idea what a happy family was. And yet, if they were on the same page, he suggested they support each other. In any case, they were both unlucky in their families. Immediately, memories of him speaking words like these came to her mind. Unlike these people, they could care for each other and truly cherish each other like family. And again, thoughts from the past, where he spoke about how they would cherish and care for each other, being the only allies in this world. Our heroine knew for sure that even if he did not remember his past, he remained on her side without knowing anything. Even if he is not the same Yulian as before, she will remember that the current Yulian also cares about her very much. Soon the guy turned around and asked the girl in surprise why she was stuck and not moving. Our heroine soon wiped away her tears, realizing that she and Yulian were slowly beginning to get closer. She started to catch up with him and say she wanted to go with him. From that moment on, a lot was about to change. The main thing that happened is that our heroine is no longer alone. She has a loving brother again. The action takes us to Zahid, who was still the same. The boy didn't want to sleep or eat, which is exactly what he was advised to do. Zahid's aunt Elizabeth Sonoran suspected he was having trouble even sitting up. She asked him not to hide anything from her. Nevertheless, the boy with his trembling voice decided to ask his aunt what she was doing there anyway. Elizabeth replied that she had come to renegotiate his engagement. At that very moment, an angry Zahid jumped up from his seat asking what kind of nonsense this was, and yet he immediately doubled over in pain. His aunt came closer and told him that after they learned he'd broken off his fourth engagement, people started sending him proposals. As expected, her handsome nephew was very popular. His aunt would find him a suitable match for Dyfenril, so he had to follow her instructions. She also told him not to even think about canceling the engagement on his own. The guy was incredibly angry, but at the same time he couldn't say anything against it because he knew the rules. If the head of the family has not reached the age of majority, the decision on his engagement is made by the acting head of the family and the council of elders. In emergency situations, the bride has a status equal to that of the wife. And besides, every bride she proposed to already had children. Zahid knew that at this rate he'd go crazy before he grew up. And as soon as this happens, his aunt will officially declare her children the heirs of Dyfenril. Of course, he could still break off the engagement at the final agreement stage, which is why she added a hefty penalty to the contract. She would be paid a fine if the engagement was broken. He knew that if he got engaged, or even if he didn't, this woman would try with all her might to take away the family title. At that very moment, the guy threw her hand away, saying that she could try to sell her nephew 4, 5, or 6 times. But he, looking into her shocked eyes, assured her that he would break off the engagement for the 7th and 8th time. With these words, he wanted to convey that she would never receive the Dyfenril family, even if he became the last head of the family. The woman smiled, saying that it was his right, but in that case she wished him to try to hold out until the very end, until he had completely exhausted his reserves. And grabbing his head, she decided to warn him that the next bride would be chosen at the upcoming meeting of the Senate. Looking into his eyes, she assumed that no one came to mind, but even if so, she was not going to look at them. Throwing the boy to the floor, Elizabeth, perplexed, said that he was pretending to be proud just like his late father. If he had simply knelt down and obeyed, he would have been treated much better as the heir to the family. But in turn, the guy continued to lie on the ground, realizing that he himself would have preferred to simply die. And yet soon he began to hit the floor with his fist because he understood that there was something here that he had to protect. He was obligated to protect the Dyfenril family and the sacred beast no matter what, and yet again his engagement was decided without his consent. Even knowing that he would have to pay a fine for violating this agreement, he would still have to prepare the termination papers. And besides Aunt Elizabeth, there were other people who would gladly try to exploit him. There was no one in this place he could trust. And yet Zahid hated himself too much, and on top of everything else, he was too weak, so much so that he could not even walk. Once again raising his head, the boy looked at the portrait of his parents and remembered them. Sobbing, lying on the floor alone in this merciless world, he spoke of how much he missed them. Soon the action takes us to our heroine, who was thinking about the shock of her grandfather, who said a lot of different things about her engagement. Even though he's said all this, he'll definitely consider the proposal of betrothal to Duke Dyfenril. The chances may be slim, but he won't rest until he's at least considered it. And yet she knew what was done was done. By this time, besides her, Zahid had probably received a ton of similar offers. They said they'd soon choose their next bride. Zahid, who lost his parents overnight and became head of the family at a young age, was now using his engagement as a bargaining chip by his aunt who wielded real power. Our heroine wanted to save him as soon as possible, but Rosie didn't have enough cards for this game. And yet she begged him to hold on a little longer and she would definitely come for him, although in reality, there wasn't much time left. While our heroes were calmly walking down the street, suddenly they heard the cries of a bewildered man asking his son why he was just standing there rooted to the spot. The man, perplexed, told the boy that he was a fool and that all this confusion had happened only because he stood there with his mouth closed. While he was still scolding the boy, Yulian looked around the corner in surprise and asked who was making such a noise. Rosie was initially surprised, but soon realized her brother didn't know everyone yet. She immediately told him their grandfather had 4 children. Murlock's eldest son, Felide's second son, Valia's eldest daughter, Monica's youngest daughter. The one screaming now is Royston Murlock's uncle's son, a 16-year-old arrogant brat. The one being scolded in turn is Uncle Felide's son, Ethan, 13 years old if Rosie isn't mistaken. She's never met him in person, so she knows little about them. Yulian was a little surprised at this point. 4 children. You could say Grandpa has excellent stamina. Anyway, the guy kept shouting, saying that Rosie was now planning to arrange a marriage with Dyfenril. They wouldn't stand by and watch these 2 worthless wretch steal Grandpa's affections. After slapping Ethan in the face, Royston said he might as well have picked up that slingshot instead. If he'd hit a child instead of an adult, Grandpa could have punished those 2. And yet the guy just kept making fun of the boy, telling him that he was utterly useless. Rosie was shocked, but she assumed Ethan was already used to Royston's outbursts. Even when he was beaten, he simply stood there and endured. But at that moment, something happened that our heroine had forgotten. She turned her head and saw her brother's furious face. She instantly analyzed him, realizing that he had a mental age of 17, a lot of suppressed anger. He was not afraid of anything, and in front of him was a wild teenager. Our heroine immediately assumed he might try to kill this guy, but they definitely didn't need that. Royston might be in danger, but he was the one in danger first. The girl smiled and asked her brother to stand still, and she in turn would take care of everything. Soon after, our heroine turned and ran towards the showdown, leaving Yulian alone. Our heroine stood in front of Ethan, telling Royston that he needs to stop, and if he wants to take out his anger, he can be angry at himself. She decided to remind him that he was the most pathetic one in the first place, so she told him to stop torturing innocent people. The guy, confused, asked what that meant since they were just playing. Rosie said it was nonsense and asked what he was talking about. Royston soon continued his words, saying that only the strongest survive here, because even his grandfather was of that opinion. The guy looked at Ethan and told him to explain himself. Was he really making fun of him, or were they just playing? After some waiting and silence, the guy yelled at him to stop being silent and say something. Ethan was so scared that he literally said, "something." And yet, soon after what he said, he asked Royston if he would be angry. Our heroine turned her head in bewilderment because she was shocked by the tone of this guy. Literally at that very moment, a bewildered bully ran towards Ethan, promising to deal with him. Rosie stood before Royston again and told him Ethan was right. As soon as Ethan said anything, he literally got angry. She decided to remind him that he was the one who said that only the strongest survives here. Turning her head, our heroine invited him to have a little fun with her brother. As soon as he saw Yulian, the guy started stuttering and saying that they were both crazy. Just because Grandpa noticed her didn't mean she was important here. He shouldn't let his guard down because she'd never get out of here. At that very moment, Yulian looked at the guy in bewilderment and asked what he was saying. Literally at that very second, the guy turned around and ran away in horror, thinking that the guys just had to wait and then they would see everything for themselves. Rosie was incredibly happy that her older brother protected her, to think she had such a wonderful older brother. He was the strongest of them all, so powerful that grandfather immediately cast aside all his children and chose him as his successor, and he is completely on her side. Soon our heroine turned her head, wondering if Ethan could begin to respect her brother. The guy in turn adjusted his glasses and shyly thanked the guys for their help. Our heroine was confused about what was wrong with this guy and his manner of speech. Ethan had stated that violence should be met with violence and that may be a fundamental decision, but right now it was a great way to escape. Our heroine looked at him assuming that he really was some kind of abnormal, and yet she was certain of something. She knew what future awaited this boy. If you look at him now, he was a very inconspicuous and skinny boy. But one day, Ethan Nort will become the greatest archmage in the Empire, respected by all. Ethan is Uncle Felide's only son, and the boy spent his childhood without much attention. His mother died immediately after the boy was born, but considering that Felide was a womanizer who never cared about his family, he was able to cope with this grief. In turn, the child who was always alone, locking himself in his room, he turned into an eccentric who only saw books about magic. Having seen Ethan and specifically what he had become, Felide completely stopped being interested in his son, declaring that he would never become an heir. It was around then that Royston started bullying him. After all, he was a lonely child with no one to turn to, a boy who never found acceptance in his family. He eventually left the estate immediately upon turning 18 and went to the Magic Tower. Ethan had always been fascinated by magic, and perhaps it was because he had a natural talent for it. Years later, the boy was able to blossom in the Magic Tower and become the greatest archmage in the Empire. Upon entering the magical tower, Ethan severed all ties with his family, and from then on he never interfered in Nort's affairs. Ethan didn't particularly favor his relatives, but he wasn't hostile to them either. But seeing Royston torment someone else was all too familiar to him, so he wanted to help Rosie, suddenly asked the boy if he often bullied him. The guy waved his hand, saying it started in childhood. Nothing special, and everyone knew it except his grandfather, of course. Our heroine screamed in bewilderment, asking if even her brother knew. The boy looked at him in surprise and nodded. The girl asked if Julian had simply stood by and remained silent. Ethan replied that Julian had never cared how badly he was beaten. Last time Royston beat him to the ground and Julian didn't even look in his direction. He just walked past whistling, carrying a whole armful of gifts for her. The boy screamed in disbelief, asking if he really was that hypocritical. Rosie couldn't even believe it. Ethan responded that Julian had always been a worthless man who only cared about his sister, a cold-blooded man who trampled everyone to become the heir. What else could one expect? As soon as he arrived here after being harshly treated by his relatives, he went through a demonic path to defeat the devil himself. But now, he still looked a little different. After the amnesia, he had become a tomboyish teenager, and his personality seemed to have shifted slightly. Rosie thought about it because Julian had just gotten angry the moment he saw the whole picture. Before his memory loss, he'd been the perfect brother to her, but after hearing Ethan, she realized Julian wasn't so perfect. Ethan suddenly asked if it was true what they say that when you lose something, you also gain it. The guy suggested that if Julian had lost his memory, then at the same time he had received the opportunity to improve his personality. Julian said in bewilderment that he saved him, then why did he feel guilty? In turn, Ethan noticed something that made him tense up and soon even start shaking. The boy pointed to the broken sea bracelet, asking the girl if it was a problem. Our heroine was horrified because she knew for sure that she had left it there on purpose so that it would not get hurt. Ethan tensed up, asking what he should do now since it was obvious that his grandfather had put a lot of effort into creating it. The boy knew that if he saw the bracelet was torn, he'd be horrified. He might misinterpret it as if Rosie had handled his gift carelessly. Our heroine looked at the bracelet, realizing that Ethan was right, because this was the first gift from her grandfather, and of course, such a loss would upset anyone. At that moment, Ethan began blaming himself, saying it was all his fault. What should he do now? In turn, Julian, perplexed, asked them what they were talking about and whether this wasn't Royston's doing. He was literally the only one who could have done something like this. And indeed, our heroine remembered his words in which he wanted to hurt Rosie by saying that her grandfather would not turn to her differently anyway. The girl literally had a premonition that he would cause trouble, but she certainly didn't think that such a method would be used. The jewelry was replaceable for now, so everything should be fine, but what if Grandpa starts wondering, does she really not want to wear his bracelet because it's cheap? And if Royston is truly at fault, he'll likely use this to create trouble. But even hiding the fact that the bracelet is broken won't solve anything. Ethan knew Royston's character, so he could have ruined the bracelet, which is why he left before them, but they still had no proof. The girl also understood that they had no evidence, and if she accused him without it, their roles might reverse, and she would be the one to blame. Julian suddenly asked her not to worry. The guy smiled and said that Royston hadn't managed to get far, which meant they would bring him back and evaporate him, and then he would admit to everything. Rosie, perplexed, told her brother that only bullies acted that way, and Julian responded by saying that was how he always solved problems. Spanking is the best medicine for bad boys. Ethan suddenly stopped Julian, telling him that in that direction was the backyard, and Royston was definitely not there. Rosie lives in a separate annex, and Julian has lost his memory and probably doesn't know anything, but Uncle Murlock always gets drunk if his plans fail. And so if he's drunk, he becomes very rowdy. Even the servants don't dare go into the backyard. Since he was going to get a scolding from Grandpa today, Murlock would definitely have to sit there and swim. Julian wondered where he could have been sitting. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He soon remembered that Murlock had been the one who tried to hit Rosie. He figured he should go and beat him up right there. However, our heroine stopped him, asking him not to do something stupid like beat up his own uncle. The girl soon smiled, asking even Royston to leave her alone until they did something wrong again. Even Ethan was surprised by this turn of events, so the guy asked in surprise what it meant. Our heroine approached him and said that thanks to him she came up with a really cool plan. She asked the boy to stop blaming himself, as the fault lay with someone else. In that case, he would be obligated to repay them tenfold. Ethan thought for a moment, then asked again if he had understood correctly about the debt. Our heroine nodded her head, saying that she was looking forward to their meal tomorrow. The action shifts to the next day. Our heroine finally wakes up, and almost immediately the maid comes into the room. After a while, the girl was ready. The Nort family was having breakfast in the main building, and she would be attending it for the first time as a family member. Rosie soon decided she needed to better prepare herself mentally for this. Firstly, her older brother would also be there. Suddenly, just as she stepped outside, our heroine heard a familiar voice. Ethan was looking at the girl, asking how she slept. Our heroine turned her head, and at first she was even surprised that he decided to talk to her. The guy replied that it took 15 minutes to get to the main building, but if she had already gone outside, it meant she had already visited Julian's chambers. At that point, Rosie decided to try changing the subject by asking the guy why he was there. The main thing was to tell him something like he wanted to go with them. The guy smiled and nodded his head, saying that they had been in the same boat since yesterday. Our heroine at this moment looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really come all this way just to go to breakfast together. The guy adjusted his glasses and nodded, saying that as long as he was with Julian, Royston wouldn't bother him. Julian in turn is with Rosie, meaning that if he's with Rosie, Royston won't bother him. Rosie then asked why he didn't go after Julian. What did she have to do with it? The guy responded sincerely, saying he was still emotionally unstable and hot-tempered. She didn't want to get involved with a difficult teenager, and then our heroine agreed. In any case, the guy said that choosing to stay with her was just a rational decision. And of course, it's not because she's the first person in this house to stand up for her or because she's a cutie. It's also not because of her beautiful smile. He also said that it wasn't because she was just good at talking, and certainly not because her innocent way of fooling people amused him. These kinds of irrational and impulsive reasons are absolutely. Nevertheless, our heroine did not let him finish. The girl began to laugh, saying that from now on he could stay with her. But first of all, she asked him to make sure that they would agree on something later at breakfast. The guy started chasing her, saying there wouldn't be any problems. It was all his fault, so he'd definitely intervene. Rosie soon asked why he hadn't said anything earlier. If he had so much pent up inside, Ethan immediately replied that it was because there was no one to listen. And so finally the action moves to lunch, which was incredibly luxurious and delicious. The entire Nort family sat in their seats and calmly served themselves, but something was still wrong. Our heroine was certainly ready for anything but seeing all those pompous faces in person. These people were literally waiting for a chance to crush her from the very beginning, so they couldn't let their guard down for a second. At this point, Caliban decided to break the silence, so after he drank some wine, he said that during his absence, he had studied the reports that described the situation here in detail. Looking at Felidi, the man assumed that he had been blatantly deceived and that he had diverted the company's funds to investing in investments. In any case, he gave him 3 months to return the money, after which he had to cover all losses out of his own pocket, Felid exclaimed in bewilderment. Then looking at Monica, he said she'd spent a huge amount of money on jewelry and that the business was on the verge of collapse. Murlock continued to drown in debt. The man slammed the table and shouted, telling the children that if they were all lacking in brains, they should curb their greed. They were obliged to put everything back in its proper place. Rosie was shocked by the incredible work they'd done to ruin everything like this. Now she understood why and how Julian became the heir. Murlock, however, turned to his father in bewilderment, deciding to start a conversation about his successor. After all, he understood that now. Caliban immediately interrupted him, telling them to look at themselves. He would never choose any of them as his successor because he had to prove his gratitude if they wanted even a small share. He couldn't understand how his children had become so pathetic, but it meant he would take over all of Julian's work. It had been he, after all, who had been doing everything before Julian arrived. Soon after, the grandfather turned to our heroine, telling her that he had news. Our heroine tensed up, but calmly asked what had happened. The man replied that from now on she was expected to attend family breakfasts as well. He smiled at her, telling her that it was time for her to move into the main house and that there was no longer any need to stay in that warehouse-like outbuilding. He also promised to make her a new seal. Rosie, hearing all this, didn't even know how to react. However, she remembered what her room looked like and decided to ask if such a luxurious and extravagant room really looked like a warehouse. The man laughed and said that he meant that the wing would still be too small for them. He soon decided to think about what would suit them and came to the conclusion that Flora would be ideal. Flora, by the way, is the second most beautiful room in the main house after Grandpa's. Her brother showed it to her once, and it turns out it used to belong to their mother. This meant that our heroine would now live there, which is why she couldn't hold back her smile and immediately thanked her grandfather. The table was gloomy, and only 3 people seemed to be feeling good. Or rather 2. Julian simply sat and enjoyed his meal, ignoring all the conversation. Yet one person couldn't resist the smiles. Royston slammed his fork on the table, asking the girl why she wasn't wearing her new bracelet. Looking at her, he said he thought she'd wear it to commemorate her first breakfast with her family. Our heroine was immediately convinced it was him. Royston was still the man who broke and tore her bracelet before leaving. Murlock decided to chime in at that moment, asking Rosie not to even mention that she'd damaged him, the bracelet his father had made himself. The girl wanted to say something, but Royston interrupted her, starting to say that no matter how young she was, such an act was unacceptable even if she accidentally tore it. However, Caliban replied that it was just a torn bracelet, and he was not the kind of person to make a fuss over such a trifle. But Murlock didn't agree with this, so he hit the table and told his father that it wasn't just a bracelet. Treating the first initiation into the family with such disrespect was unforgivable. Punishment for such an act was the order of the day. Rosie asked if Uncle really thought so. Murlock was furious, saying that his father himself had created him, and that he had changed his route for the sake of the bracelet. Our heroine at that very moment looked at him in surprise and asked if he really didn't remember what happened yesterday. The man looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Rosie sighed heavily and explained that she hadn't intended to bring it up, but it seemed she had no choice. The girl turned to her grandfather and said that the whole thing was because his gift had been destroyed yesterday. Caliban listened attentively. Our heroine continued to say that while passing by through the backyard, she accidentally bumped into her uncle. The man was so drunk that he literally snatched the envelope from her and trampled on it in anger. The girl lowered her head sadly, saying that as a result of this, her bracelet shattered into pieces. The man immediately started shouting and confronting her, asking how she dared to slander her. He also asked if she had any evidence. Turning his head, he begged his father to just look at her, how small she was, but he was already lying. This was clearly the temple's influence. However, at that very second, a hand rose from behind the table, and soon a voice said that he was a witness to what had happened. Our heroine was incredibly happy that Ethan had kept his word which he had given her before going inside. The guy said he saw it all with his own eyes. Uncle Murloc was drunk and trampled on the bracelet. The man actually tensed up at that moment, asking the boy what he was talking about. Ethan continued to say that because Rosie had lived in the outbuilding before she didn't know she shouldn't have gone into the backyard yesterday. If he hadn't bravely intervened to save her, Rosie would have gotten a couple of punches herself. And she thanked him for saving her and then said that from now on he became her beloved brother. The boys looked at him in bewilderment, assuming that he was already starting to overdo it a little. However, the guy continued to say that entering the garden where even servants do not go was a brave act, and Rosie was so overwhelmed with emotion that clinging to him she cried for a long time. But Murloc still insisted that it was all a lie, and he decided to set him up because he was drunk and didn't remember anything. Our heroine asked in surprise, was he really that drunk and couldn't remember anything? In that case, they should check the soles of his shoes from yesterday and the grass in the backyard. And if she was right, there should be traces and crumbs of seashells left behind. The man soon tensed, deciding that it really was his doing. Caliban decided that this was a reasonable remark, so he turned to the servant and ordered him to check Murloc's boots. Our heroine was incredibly happy that everything worked out exactly as she expected. The action moves back some time when the boys were secretly watching from behind the bushes. Meanwhile, in the backyard, there was indeed an angry Murloc walking around continuing to drink. As soon as the boys noticed that he was moving towards them, Ethan quickly poured the shell crumbs onto the ground. Just a few moments later, the man walked across those same shells and didn't even react in any way. The action moves to the present, where the butler checked the garden and said that everything was correct. There really were traces of the bracelet left in the garden. But more importantly, there were also shell-like shards on the soles of his boots, which meant only one thing. Murloc and Royston instantly tensed in horror. And yet the man still screamed that they were lying about everything. Rosie, perplexed, asked if he really meant they'd planned it all in advance. That's some level of self-deception. In any case, the crime of destroying the first gift from the head of the family will require several days of punishment. Or perhaps looking at him, she asked if he thought the bracelet his grandfather had personally made wasn't worth it. Naturally, Murloc remembered his own words. However, our heroine said that if Royston had not raised this topic, she would have continued to remain silent. Now she looked at the boy's face who had accepted his defeat. Mentally, she told him not to even try to mess with her again. After all, she can take care of herself even without her older brother. She also said she wasn't stupid enough to ruin the first breakfast here by destroying the bracelet. The man in turn began to complain about how this was literally a disgrace in front of his nephews. Caliban asked his son how he dared ruin a gift he'd made. He was certainly cheap, so he wouldn't ask for compensation, but he still should have thought twice about his behavior this week. Murloc started to try to say something in his defense, but he began to stutter. The head of the family soon shouted, saying it wasn't the bracelet but his pathetic behavior. If it happened again, he'd ban him from drinking alcohol for life. Now defeated Murloc nodded his head and told his father that he would be more careful from now on. And yet soon after this small misunderstanding, the man looked at his granddaughter and said that their conversation was not over yet. Our heroine smiled and told her grandfather to continue. Caliban immediately told her to stop by his office during lunch. He explained that he had received a letter from the Duke of Dyfenryl yesterday, and the letter stated that she was being considered as a potential bride. At that very moment, our heroine was shocked and didn't even know how to react. She was overwhelmed with emotions as thoughts of finally seeing Zahid filled her head. Of course, when our heroine was beaming with happiness, there were those who couldn't stand it and wanted to spray their poison around. Murloc suddenly turned to his father and said that in the long run this marriage would not be beneficial to their family. He'd heard about the situation with the head of Dyfenryl, hadn't he? He was on the verge of collapse, so what would his former glory cost them? At that moment, Caliban became angry again at the mere word profit. The man jumped up and slammed the table, asking his son if he thought he was doing business here after they had accumulated all this wealth he wanted to give his granddaughter away for money. Murloc was once again at a loss. Felidi decided to intercede on his behalf, telling his father that allying with the Duchy of Dyfenryl to confront the temple could prove costly. In addition, they decided to note that Rosa had the blood of a temple servant in her veins, which meant that involving her in such a serious matter was strange. Our heroine was about to give up hope, but at that moment her grandfather, perplexed, asked if his blood flowed through her veins. Her divine power had awakened not only by her own will. The man said that he did not feel hatred towards the temple. He simply could not stand it when innocent children were drawn into this disgrace. And more importantly, he will no longer tolerate discrimination against Rosie based on her pedigree. Our heroine was incredibly happy to hear these words of support. At that moment, Monica decided to join the conversation and said that Rosie was still too young. This child was too naive for her age. After all, it is important to understand that an engagement is a union between two families, and it would be too early to publicly announce it now. Once again, the woman decided to remind everyone that the girl had wasted 137 billion gold coins as if nothing had happened. She'd previously advised Julian on investments, but how could she have spent such a sum without thinking? Julian was seething with anger, but the girl begged her brother to calm down. Monica suspected that Julian might have talked about this before the mine was dug, but she had no sense of timing or investment sense. The woman was saying she didn't even understand numbers, so how could she send a stupid child to Dyfenril? At that moment, fresh news was brought to the table. Monica continued screaming, saying that although they were in a sad situation, the Dyfenril family was still the Dyfenril family. Ethan also started reading the newspaper at that moment and was shocked. While Monica continued to shout, saying that it would be easier for them to leave the game themselves, everyone had already read the news and simply fell silent. Turning her head, the woman asked her brothers in bewilderment if they could hear her and why they were all silent. Just then, the girl spotted a newspaper, the headline of which caught her eye. She instantly snatched it up and began reading while our heroine sat there with a satisfied grin. The newspaper reported that the Reborn mine was a complete failure. Contrary to the temple visitors' expectations, the cave was empty and the stone yield was only 1%. The next headline was that the prices of magic stones had literally skyrocketed. Monica couldn't believe her eyes. Now one could only imagine how Rosie's 137 billion gold investment chart had skyrocketed. In the past, our heroes were once discussing what usually happens in the main building during breakfast. An interesting part of the breakfast was that the newspaper was served with dessert. A huge argument was raging about this very thing, the world, and everything that was happening around them, and every word was a test from Grandpa. It would get so heated that everyone would immediately forget about food. Our heroine was surprised by this, which is why she asked if it was really that serious. Julian nodded his head and soon mentioned that they'd have to go there someday. They serve delicious food there. And once again, the action takes us to the present day. Julian read his newspaper in shock, saying that he truly was a genius. Looking at the headline, the guy was shocked to discover that the girl wasn't joking. So what should he do with this incredible talent? Incidentally, to avoid suspicion, the girl said that he had been the one who had asked her about it in the past. The boy, meanwhile, proudly declared himself the only genius among these idiots. Everyone should be wary of a brilliant genius like him. Looking at his relatives, he asked if it would be easy for them to go all in, but he had made the decision himself. The boy wondered why everyone had gone quiet. For some reason, he couldn't hear someone slandering him. Had they really swallowed their tongues? All the relatives were in shock. Julian laughed proudly and smugly, telling them all to speak their minds. Rosie, for her part, wondered why she couldn't even lift her head. However, at that moment, Caliban sighed heavily and turned to Julian. The boy turned his head in bewilderment and asked again, to which the grandfather replied that he should stay after breakfast. Seeing his table manners, he wondered how much his memory had been impaired. Julian even shuddered a little at that moment, just how creepy it was. Rosie in turn started giggling. And yet, having also looked at the newspaper, our heroine decided that she was rich again. That's why she was now absolutely sure that she could save Zahid. After some time, our heroine approached Shulba, asking him to dispose of the money received from investments in stones in the following way. She wanted to return 150 billion gold to Julian. At that moment, Shulba was even a little surprised by the incredible interest rate. Proudly adjusting her hair, the girl reminded him that she had promised to take care of the money and manage it wisely. Shulba agreed, saying that was very impressive. And yet managing the remaining amount isn't so simple. Only 50 billion are designated for use, but what about the rest? At that moment, our heroine handed over a letter and asked that it be conveyed to the head of the magic tower. He would sort it out himself. The guy nodded and said he understood everything. Rosie, however, said she still had a lot of unfinished business, so she was counting on him. Shulba replied that he was even glad about this because lately it seemed to him that all his affairs had suddenly ended. Rosie asked in surprise if he really had nothing to do, to which he replied that before he didn't even have time to sleep because of all his affairs, but Yulian is not the same as before. Anyway, the guy even said that he would think about resigning next month. Our heroine was instantly shocked. What did he mean by resign? Did he really want to quit? The girl began to tug at him, asking if he was joking. Shulba replied that the gentleman needed a teacher now, not an assistant, so the count kept him after the meal. The guy added that he had no business there, which meant Rosie definitely thought he was serious. She suddenly asked if he wouldn't be better off living a simple life. And yet, despite all the talk and advice, he said that an easy life simply did not interest him. The guy was genuinely happy living a hectic and busy life. Being truly useful was what he wanted. Rosie had no idea who could have such a desire. Be that as it may, he said he was planning to retire soon and had discussed it with the previous Yulian. The girl, perplexed, asked what he was talking about. Shulba replied that they were true friends, but now no one could be trusted, so he became an assistant. Once he grew up, they agreed to return to their old relationship. That's what they both wanted. Our heroine realized that these two had managed to make a secret promise to each other, and yet, Rosie asked, what if her brother soon regained his memory and asked him to join him? What would he do? The boy, perplexed, replied that he would be diligently flashing his heels. He certainly couldn't hide the papers of her marriage to the Duke forever. Without even taking into account his position as a servant who must obey his superior, Yulian will try to kill him when he realizes that he helped Rosie with her engagement. That is why the guy smiled and asked the lady not to worry about him when she entrusted him with a lot of work. The girl asked if he was really telling the truth, to which Shulba replied that he was frankly speaking very pleased, since lately he hadn't even known what to do with himself. Soon he turned around and said that if she had any instructions, she should feel free to contact him. It was at this very moment that a brilliant idea came to our heroine. The guy was already saying goodbye and was about to leave the room when suddenly Rosie stopped him. The girl asked him if he would like to work for her, as she was looking for someone experienced and able to work hard to help her. And yet the action smoothly takes us to the door of the meeting room. The butler informs us that Yulian will be joining us for dinner. Our heroine asked in surprise what this meant. The butler laughed, saying that their conversation after breakfast had dragged on a bit. Our heroine sighed with relief, saying she was so glad everything went so well, although she knew it would. Ever since her brother lost his memory, he'd become as hot-tempered as their grandfather. The butler tensed up a little at that moment. Pointing to them, he said that even if they were too similar, it didn't mean they were perfect for each other. At that moment, the guys looked at each other clearly, making it clear that they were in a confrontation. Rosie even tensed a little, not understanding this oppressive atmosphere. It seemed Grandpa didn't like that troublemaker Yulian. And yet, just at that moment, the man turned his head and instantly changed. He was glad Rosie had come. Yulian had changed in the same way, imagining that it must have been hard to travel such a long way on his short legs. Well, it certainly all looked too strange and artificial, which is why the girl didn't really understand what was going on. Just then, both Grandpa and Yulian pointed to the seat next to them and invited her to sit. Rosie was shocked. Where was she supposed to sit? Yulian soon said that he still lacked table manners, so Rosie had to sit next to him. But Grandpa replied that he'd forgotten how he'd spent the last few hours studying etiquette. Let him figure it out for himself now. Then he asked if a nobleman was really allowed to behave carelessly, especially in the presence of a count. Yulian, even more surprised, asked what he was talking about, considering he'd spent half his life eating street scraps. And yet Caliban turned to his granddaughter and asked her to sit next to him because he had a gift for her. Literally at that very second, our heroine made her choice, choosing her grandfather's side. Our heroine soon apologized to her brother, saying that she hoped that he would take the opportunity to learn that sometimes everything can be resolved through friendship. And yet soon it was time to give the gift. Grandpa pulled out a box, and when Rosie opened it, she saw a beautiful bracelet. Our heroine looked at this beautiful decoration in shock, saying that it was very beautiful. The man smiled and said she should have asked for pearls because what are these seashells? As expected, the grandfather knew how to manage money. He bought this necklace so that she could compare the difference in quality, and if instead of a bracelet there were pearls, Murloc would not have been able to crush it so easily. And yet the girl said she really did like the shell bracelet and was sad when it was trampled. Caliban asked her not to worry about it as it was cheap. But Rosie replied that she'd planned to weave a thread bracelet for her grandfather as a token of gratitude, but decided to stop before it was too late. It was useless after all. The man, perplexed, said that sometimes people can speak with both lips. Rosie replied that in the future, if she spoke so inarticulately, she would refuse like a well-mannered adult. Soon the maid came and started pouring tea for everyone, and Grandpa looked at Julian, suggesting that he should at least get a basic education. He assured his grandson that he would appoint the best tutors for him in all fields that very day. When he first arrived here, he insisted he could handle it, refusing any help. Perhaps this time it wouldn't be so bad to take things step by step. But of course he will no longer be able to attend the Noble Academy due to his age. Rosie suddenly caught herself worrying, seeing how tense the atmosphere was here. It turned out that Grandpa was ready to take Julian in, even if he was an ignorant brat. Grandpa regretted taking his grandson too late, but it wasn't all that bad. He also said there was no need to rush because everything was for the best. The guy nodded and said he understood. Rosie now saw that they truly were on good terms. Just at that moment, Julian put a cup of tea on the table, assuring that he was in no hurry. He asked his grandfather again if he'd seen all these investments. Even without any knowledge, he'd managed to achieve such success and results, and he'd continue to see it. At that very moment, our heroine caught herself thinking that her brother was going in the wrong direction. Rosie even covered her face with her hands, realizing that because of her brother's antics, she had to blush every time. The guy also said that his table manners had improved, while little one still had a long way to go. Caliban's hand tightened with anger. Slamming his hand on the table, the man demanded to know how he dared to sign his seal and the engagement. If his memory returned, he would cut off the hand he'd used to sign the seal. Our heroine immediately began defending her brother, who instantly fell silent. The girl said he was innocent and she herself had placed the seal while he slept. Julian also claimed that Rosie only did it to help her grandfather. After all, she was considering joining the ducal family. And once again, a fire began to burn between them, which our heroine undoubtedly did not like, and it could not continue like this. The girl soon began to scream, asking them to stop arguing. She immediately declared that she truly wanted to marry Duke Dyfenril. She declared that she had been in love with him since early childhood, and no one else could have him but her. She planned to marry them as soon as he came of age. Both grandfather and Julian jumped up in bewilderment, asking what kind of nonsense this was. The man said there was nothing special about Dyfenril. Their estate was considered mediocre, as the family had pounced on the family and devoured their entire fortune after the death of the Count and Countess. Julian in turn reminded his sister that he was still a genius, even though his memory had faded, but if she needed any help, she just needed to wait a little, and he would do everything for her. And even more so, why immediately propose to someone she'd never met? Even his grandfather agreed with his grandson's words. And yet our heroine had no idea how she could explain it. It would be impossible to prove that she remained in his debt before her rebirth. And since this is true, she hasn't met Zahid yet, and all she can say is that she saw him in a photograph in the newspaper, and he is very handsome. That's why she wants to get engaged to him so badly. She decided that she had to get this man. And yet she plans to pay a visit to Duke Dyfenril soon, and if anyone dares to interfere, then... She declared that she wouldn't weave the bracelet she'd promised her grandfather out of string. The man immediately tensed up. Julian soon shouted, saying he was going to intervene anyway, and was determined to use all his strength to it. Caliban had already turned away, saying nothing. Our heroine suddenly smiled and said she was worried about her brother too. Right now he has nothing, so he doesn't even know how to intervene. The guy immediately panicked, realizing that she was indeed right. Thus the action takes us to the day when our heroine was supposed to go to Duke Dyfenril. Just before leaving, Julian approached little one, asking if she was really heading to the Duke's estate. He too wanted to go and see the scoundrel's face in person. Rosie asked. Surprised if he shouldn't be in class right now, Julian replied that he was, and she'd go with him. She wasn't getting the knowledge she needed from her class, so it was time to get smarter. The girl in turn replied that she was young enough to enter a noble academy, and who needed to spend all their time in boring classes now. The guy was shocked that this child was so amazing. He said that if this was boring, she could admire his handsome face. He soon spoke of a time when simply looking at each other was enough. Our heroine suddenly apologized, saying she was touched by the book he and her grandfather had given her. That's why she promised that she would try to become a child who could look within herself and try to overcome the difficulties that awaited her. The guy was shocked by how the little one managed to get around everything so well. Rosie, in turn, began to admire the carriage, which was quite spacious. Soon she climbed inside and began to say goodbye to her brother, saying that she was now going in search of a handsome man. Julian cried out in bewilderment, saying that he was just a handsome guy with nothing special about him. The carriage moved off anyway, and the guy continued shouting to his sister, warning her that he had nothing but a pretty face. Soon our heroes left the Count's estate and headed towards Duke Dyfenril. Our heroine also went with Shulba, whom she asked in surprise how her dear brother took his dismissal. The guy adjusted his glasses and said that since he had already received a new position, he could not protest, although he had something to say. When Shulba suggested returning to simple friendship, I was able to experience his relief. However, all of the lady's requests were handled with the utmost care, and her wishes were fulfilled exactly as intended. Our heroine smiled and told her dear Shulba that everything was right. Her engagement to Zahid was simply inevitable. Ethan also went with them, recording everything minute by minute at 9 a.m. Rosie exuded boundless confidence that the engagement would happen, one victory, and she thought she'd conquered the world. The boys didn't understand why he was writing everything down, but they soon remembered that he had agreed with Julian to provide hourly reports on his sister's activities. Well, what can I say? Let him keep playing. He's unlikely to cause them any trouble. The boy continued to watch them closely, and their silence was enough for him to continue. In any case, after some time, the guys reached the Dyfenril estate. Once inside, they were met by the butler, who said that they had received her letter, but it was not worth it to come such a long way. Her visit at this point was a bit unexpected. Discussions about potential brides were ongoing, and he could only suggest coming another time. Zahid was currently unable to receive guests due to his health. Ethan wrote down everything verbatim, claiming the butler was trying to send them away, and that they were hiding the Duke like a precious treasure. The man stated that Lady Elizabeth would deal with her request immediately after the discussion was completed. Our heroine said that this was very touching, and in that case she should wait right in front of the door to the conference room. The man tensed up at this point, asking what she meant. He couldn't leave an important guest standing in the hallway. However, the girl replied that the floor outside the conference room would be ideal for her. The butler, perplexed, said that this was not what he meant, and the girl replied that this marble looked very cozy. With a heavy sigh, the man realized he couldn't send them away any longer. Ethan recorded that Rosie had insisted on setting up camp next to the conference room. As we approached the doors of the conference room, we could hear bewildered cries from within, which indicated that all of this was simply outrageous. They were perplexed that Rosie Nort was the final choice, suggesting that the elders had gone mad. The boys asked what kind of witchcraft this was. Rosie, for her part, laughed heartily at the idea of democracy, but the butler and Ethan were very tense. Ethan knew it wasn't a pleasant situation, but the girl headed for the door anyway. The butler tried to stop her, but a moment later, the girl opened the door, saying that Lady Rosie Nort was completely at their service. The girl apologized, saying she hadn't meant to eavesdrop, though it was useful, so she was destined to become Zahid's bride. It worked out very well. At that very moment, all the elders in the hall became even more tense from the sudden turn of events. Ethan peeked into the room and nevertheless wrote down that after Rosie's calculated eavesdropping, she moved on to the contract. The woman screamed, asking how much they were paid for this. How many gold coins did the vultures get? Our heroine smiled, realizing that people had received so much that she could not even imagine. If Elizabeth hoped to buy votes for her chosen daughter-in-law, the simplest solution was to bet even more. Our impeccable Shulba managed to take care of this very issue. The order was to pay 100 times more than Elizabeth. Investing in magic stones made the girl super rich, which meant she now had to fight hellfire. Elizabeth at that moment ran up to the girl, asking if she knew who she was dealing with and what game she was playing if she came out of nowhere like that. However, Shulba stood in front of the girl and greeted Lady Elizabeth, asking if he would like to see something interesting. He held up the newspaper and stated that it was this particular edition of the newspaper that had attracted their attention, as the figures in the background were very intriguing. Upon closer inspection, he realized why Mr. Sonoran had been so desperate to send her to this estate. The photo showed Elizabeth's beloved husband and the unfamiliar girl he was embracing. At that very second, the woman's face changed, saying that they were just pathetic scoundrels. Elizabeth Sonoran is a woman who married Count Sonoran, leaving Dyfenril behind. But Shulba's investigation also revealed an incredible secret. Rosie smiled sweetly as she said it was tragic that her generous payment to Sonoran was funding her husband's love affairs. The woman was overwhelmed with emotion and couldn't even answer, so she covered her face with her hand. Soon after, she walked out of the conference room in silence. Naturally, Ethan looked at her and began to write down the news for Mr. Yulian. At 2:40 p.m., Rosie sent a very nasty woman packing her tactics, including bribery and affairs, are a dead ringer for Yulians. And yet, after some time, the butler again reminded them that Mr. Yulian was feeling extremely unwell, so it would be better for them to reconsider their decision. Ethan recorded that Rosie was closer to her goal. The girl had just told the butler that having come all this way, she simply had to see her fiancé's face. The girl stated that she is now his fiancé, so she believes that Dyfenril gives the Nort family powers equal to direct family members. Ethan couldn't understand why she was so obsessed with seeing his face or what kind of upbringing she'd received. The butler, for his part, sighed heavily, realizing he'd been outdone again. A short time later, they arrived at Zahid's room. As soon as the butler entered, he informed the master that he had guests. Ethan was thinking at this time about what Yulian had said about Zahid not looking that good in the photos, but what was the reality? Literally, as soon as he saw the Duke's face, the guy changed his mind and began writing a note for himself, saying that Yulian should abandon all hope. He literally had no idea who had taken such worthless photographs of Duke Dyfenril. The thing was, Zahid was just incredibly stunning. Our heroine finally waited for that very moment when they met. And yet, looking at him, she saw only an exhausted boy, so she understood that the incredible power must be causing him terrible pain. And yet, despite all this suffering, he simply continued to endure. But the most important thing is that all this is done to prevent the temple from taking its sacred fire animal. Zahid once told her about this. After his parents' death, his relatives repeatedly betrayed him. The boy had already fought off the explosion of magic and was then used by his aunt as a marriage pawn. That is why right now one could see that he was going through all this torment himself. Before their rebirth, they were always separated by iron bars, but right now everything was different. Now our heroine could finally see him without any obstacles, alive, real. The action takes us back to that very day from the past, which was a very ordinary prison day. Just at that moment, our heroine was brought food, and as always, there was not too much. Rosie turned around and told her cellmate that they had only been given 2 more pieces. Naturally, her cellmate was a wolf, Zahid's sacred animal. The wolf began to growl in frustration, implying that he was hungry. He was both disappointed and angry, and our heroine simply said that he could be angry and sad as much as he wanted, but they still needed to eat it. Her task was to get closer to the divine beast, which suddenly barked, making it clear that she was also hungry. The experiments she underwent to achieve this were extremely painful, but ultimately they helped her establish contact with him. The girl soon said she wasn't hungry. She knew that Zahid would be coming today, so he would have to bring something to eat. Today was a full moon, and this is the very day when she sees Zahid once a month. But the day she had been so desperately waiting for turned out differently, and soon after that, the whole story began. Before his death, the boy said that if they were reborn, he asked her to live freely. Zahid advised her to go to the seashore, which she had always dreamed of seeing, and now that she had learned to read, she could go to the academy and make friends. He also asked her to save his brother, the one she loved most in the world. Rosie cried, asking what would happen to him. The guy smiled, saying that in his youth he didn't trust anyone and was full of hatred, so there was no point in looking for an arrogant brat surrounded by thorns. But our heroine still assured him that when she came to her senses, she would find him and save him no matter what. And yet Zahid begged her not to do it because his youth was filled with mistrust of people, and he wouldn't be able to treat her well, but she didn't care. Even if he says no, she'll still do it. Zahid smiled, telling her that it would hurt her in the end. This brat might fall in love with her, but he'll never show it. He's young and he's always been sure he knows everything. Our heroine began to scream desperately, starting to tell him various words of support, but the guy interrupted her. Zahid finally said that if she didn't plan to cure this hopeless boy and marry him, then she shouldn't do it. Still, he knew how selfish it sounded, but all he wanted was for her to be happy. Our heroine pressed herself against the net and began to say that she would save him no matter what it cost her. And then the moment of truth, a meeting with the young Zahid. The young man looked at the girl in surprise and asked who she was. The current him didn't know her. Rosie naturally expected such a reception, but deep down this attitude towards a stranger still hurt. And yet the butler declared that this was Rosie Nort of the Nort family, and also his new bride, as the council had decided today. The boy was very surprised, which led him to ask in confusion why it was someone his own age. Had they really changed their tactics? Soon he asked where his aunt had gone. The man replied that the lady had gone to the Sonoran estate on urgent business. Rosie smiled and said that the lady would not return, as they had already taken care of that. The boy sighed heavily, assuming that his uncle's place had now been taken by Count Noart. Rosie understood that he had always been used, which was why he was always distrustful. And yet the guy turned around saying they'd end it right now. He decided to prepare the papers to call off the engagement. Our heroine quickly came to her senses, asking the Duke to wait and listen to her, but the guy asked her to stand still and not come closer. He looked at her with disdain, clearly indicating that she should get out of there. With a heavy sigh, our heroine realized that everything would be much more difficult than she had hoped. Soon she told Zahid that everything was correct, and to be honest, everything he said was true. He really is an arrogant brat covered in thorns, full of mistrust of people. Zahid screamed in bewilderment, asking what kind of nonsense this was. Our heroine smiled and asked him not to be nervous when he felt unwell. After all, he could have damaged his vocal cords, or it would have been better for him to worry about his soul. The guy was surprised, assuming she was genuinely worried about him. Ethan recorded everything that happened, amazed that they could now have an open conversation. And yet, despite the way she spoke to him, the guy found some downsides and simply shouted, telling her to get away. At that very moment, the sacred wolf woke up and soon looked at the guests in surprise. A moment later, a huge wolf was running towards the girl, causing the Duke to come to his senses in shock. He ordered fire to stop and not touch her, but it was too late because the animal was already flying towards the bewildered girl. The guy was already screaming in horror that the girl wouldn't harm them in any way, so there was no point in attacking her. Just then, the wolf approached the girl and began to cuddle. Her Zahid was speechless. In turn, the wolf began to bark joyfully. Rosie immediately realized that he was glad to see her. And it was actually amazing to watch because literally everyone had forgotten about her, but now she expected nothing less. The girl hugged Fire and was incredibly happy that he remembered her. Maybe it's because he's a divine beast? They're closest to the gods, and perhaps that's why he wasn't affected by the time jump. In any case, the girl was incredibly happy that at least someone remembered her. She thanked Fire for remembering her. Before her rebirth, our heroine often cried in the dungeon, thinking about everything that had happened. In those moments, only Zahid comforted her. He told her she could cry, but only with him, because knowing she was crying alone and suffering simply broke his heart. Right now, the bars of her cage were no longer between them, but he would no longer comfort her. That's all because only she and Fire remember all the conversations that took place between them. Ethan noted in confusion that the sacred wolf had become attached to Rosie, and that it seemed to have a thing for cute things too. Zahid called Fire to him, but the wolf completely ignored him and sat next to the girl. The guy guessed that this divine beast originally belonged to Rosie, but it was taken away from her. Or Rosie's father was from the Dyfenril family. Zahid was at a loss at this point and didn't even know what to say. He suddenly decided to ask if he was really Dyfenril by blood. But the wolf immediately waved his paws, letting even Ethan know that everything was not so. The action takes us back to the past. Our heroine asked Zahid how old he was, and the boy smiled, asking how old he looked. She thought for a moment and soon said that he looked 25 and she was 16. Zahid even tensed up at that moment because he couldn't even imagine that anyone could give him a look of 25 years. Rosie asked, surprised if he was even older, but in any case it was all good because she liked older men. She could rely on them. The girl assumed it was because of her brother. There was a big age difference between them. Zahid thought about it, soon saying it was a relief. Well, he's a bit older. If you think about it, at that time he was only a year older than her, then why does he always act like an adult? Well, even now he was mature beyond his years. The boy suddenly said that he had never seen his wolf cling so closely to anyone other than him. Zahid looked in bewilderment first at the girl and then at the wolf, asking Rosie what she had done to him. Our heroine paused for a moment, then calmly replied that she simply existed. Ethan wrote this down as the most unnecessary response, but surprisingly still very kind. The guy opened his mouth and asked in confusion what this meant, but our heroine changed the subject anyway. She assured him that she would remain his fiancée and that he would soon be free to act. Zahid, surprised, asked what she was talking about. The girl replied that she had ordered the magic tower to prepare a calming potion, and they no longer had financial problems. The magic tower was originally supposed to go bankrupt after the sharp drop in the price of magic stones when news about that mine surfaced. Later, the temple broke in and captured the magic tower while it was resisting. That's why after the discovery of the shaft's tiny filling potions could no longer be brewed in the tower, the temple controlled the nobility under the guise of magical regulation. They would never have allowed this to happen, but this time Rosie averted bankruptcy. She managed to invest a huge sum. Thanks to her enormous investment, the tower was spared destruction and restored. And when the prices for magic stones jumped, the tower stopped experiencing financial difficulties. Now that they were no longer at risk of capture, the tower had lost its fear, so she told them to spend the remaining money on producing the potion. Rosie stated that medicine would arrive soon, and with their help he would be able to control his mana emissions, and then he would be able to freely lead his family. The guy replied in surprise that now that the tower had started producing potions, he just needed to buy them so Noart didn't need to interfere. Our heroine replied that her order was incredibly large, so she was afraid that they would not be able to accept new orders in the near future. The girl waved her hand, asking him to just take it since she had a lot of money and it could be considered just an engagement gift. The guy suddenly asked her. The girl abruptly interrupted him and said that she wasn't just anyone but Rosie. In any case, he asked why she was going so far. Rosie, surprised, said she wanted to get engaged to him and didn't want to break up. The guy, perplexed, said that's what he was asking. What was the point of all this? The way he could expel his mana was definitely not a useful trait for Noart. It made it impossible for them to interfere in the Dyfenril family's affairs. The Great Assembly of Nobility has only a few years left before they lose all their powers. Are these few years really that important? Our heroine looked at him in surprise and said that it didn't matter at all. Zahid, in this case, wanted to know even more why she wanted to get engaged to him so much. Looking at fire, our heroine thought about the High Priest's goal, to control the divine beasts of all four families. To achieve this, the temple would persecute them. That's why our heroine wanted to be there, just to protect Zahid. And more importantly, the words she never got to say before her rebirth. The girl looked into Zahid's eyes, telling him that it was all because she liked him. At that time, she was a burden to him, and she was afraid of becoming an even greater burden to him. That's why she never dared to say those words, but now she has every chance, and she assured him that she really likes him. At that very moment, Ethan began jotting down notes, saying the situation was a complete emergency. At first glance, Rosie's behavior remained unchanged, but she suddenly confessed her feelings to a cheeky guy she'd just met. Zahid, perplexed, asked the girl what she'd said, and she replied that she liked him. Without a doubt, she decided to clarify that he was a little hopeless now, but she thought it would be good to first raise him properly, and then when he grew up, marry him. The boy, perplexed, yelled and blushed, asking what she was talking about. The girl replied that for that to happen, they would need to maintain communication, meeting up occasionally. He kept shouting, asking how she could say she liked him on their first date. Did she really think he would believe it? Rosie said, surprised that she was the one confessing her feelings. So why was he so shy? There's nothing strange about liking someone else. The guy, perplexed, replied that it was because of her that everything was becoming more awkward. Ethan recorded that at 3:31 p.m. they were seriously and awkwardly talking about their attraction to each other. And yet, he didn't understand what these children could know. Shouldn't they be at least 13 to talk about love? Like him, for example. Just then, our heroine raised her hand, saying they could do it differently. 15 years. She'll wait until that age. If after this period he still didn't like her, then the engagement would be broken off unconditionally, and she herself understood that this engagement was forced. Zahid asked if she was joking because at that age everyone who's in a relationship gets married. Doesn't that mean she'll marry him anyway? He instantly refused, and our heroine was surprised that he caught her, although she was just trying to push him. In that case, she decided to wait until he came of age. If he didn't fall in love with her by the time he came of age, they could break off the engagement. But still, she absolutely had to come up with a reason, even if it meant forcing it. Her brother, who had lost his memory, was able to love her again. Maybe if she tried hard enough, even Zahid could open his heart to her again. Rosie assured him he would definitely fall in love with her. Anyway, after finishing talking about this proposal, she asked him what he thought of the idea. At that moment, he covered his face with his hand, saying that he thought it was just absurd. But if this is her way of getting payment for the potion from the tower, then he has no reason to refuse and he'll break up with her anyway. A preteen engagement won't hurt him. Our heroine was in incredible shock and didn't even know how to react to such wonderful news. Ethan was equally shocked and immediately began writing a note saying that they had finally decided to get engaged. Zahid nevertheless blushed and clarified that her feelings could change during this time. Rosie laughed and told him not to even hope for that. Only later would he fall in love with her. Ethan suddenly wondered, wouldn't breaking off an engagement happen naturally once someone reaches adulthood, even if someone's feelings change? Zahid blushed and asked the girl not to get her hopes up as he wouldn't fall in love with her. Ethan recorded Zahid's loud statement as well as the fact that his ears continued to turn red. Ethan even drew an illustration, thinking it would be funny if he cried and begged not to leave him. Rosie said after a while that it would take several days to deliver the calming potion from the tower, and until then it would be difficult for him to move. The girl also suggested that there wasn't a single person here he could trust. Zahid couldn't argue with that. Our heroine, in turn, wanted to recommend Shulba as an assistant. This was an emergency, and as his fiancée, she had the right to do so. She assured him that she would replace his entire staff with reliable people and tell him how to restore the Duke's estate since she already had the experience. Shulba soon introduced himself. Zahid responded by saying he could handle everything on his own, but Rosie reminded him he was only 11 years old. He needed a reliable adult. And in any case, if he doesn't like it, he can fire them. As soon as the potion arrives from the tower, he'll be free. Shulba, for his part, said that wouldn't happen as he was confident in his abilities. Rosie thought so too, because if he was a child who only knew about clothes, then all of Shulba's efforts would be in vain. Our heroine turned and told the boy that she had already paid Shulba his salary for the year. Since she was his fiancée starting next year, he would be paying for it himself. She advised Zahid to sign a contract with Shulba, and our heroine congratulated her brother's old assistant on his new position. The girl smiled and said that she hoped that he would like the job she gave him. Ethan was surprised. Taking notes, he assumed it had something to do with the flower shop he'd gone to with Shulba, where she'd asked him to pick out the most beautiful bouquet. Shulba smiled and thanked the lady, saying that this was exactly what he wanted. Unlimited housework. Rosie was glad she'd hit the mark. She even saw that the house was a complete mess and needed to be fixed. Ethan amused himself by the fact that the bouquet had always been for Shulba, which made the situation even funnier. Well, Zahid looked at the bouquet with an expression on his face as if she gave it to him, it would fly into the trash, which served as a lesson to him. Soon our heroine petted Fire and announced that she now had to leave. The girl assured him that they would see each other again because she would never lose Zahid again. At that moment, the wolf barked joyfully, thanking the girl for not leaving them. Our heroine almost cried at that moment because she realized that Fire definitely understood everything. He felt like she was trying to change the future so that it wouldn't be as terrible as her past life. At that moment, the guy asked Rosie not to say stupid things because they never had a plan to set the plan on fire. At that moment, the wolf began to growl in surprise, expressing his pity for the little guy. The girl sighed, saying that was true. He didn't understand anything yet. But in any case, she suggested they be lenient since he was still young. Zahid, perplexed, said that he was only a year younger. And yet our heroine turned to Fire and asked him to stay by her side. She knows that no matter how much he likes her, he wants to stay with Zahid. Even when he was imprisoned with Rosie, he continued to wait for Zahid all this time. At that moment, the wolf started barking, telling them to finally get married and not do anything stupid. At that very moment, our heroine didn't understand him. Fire had definitely been able to convey his emotions before. The temple people threatened the animal and told it to try harder not to dwell on these emotions. Rosie was forced to read the desperate message the beast was delivering. Looking at the wolf who barked and pointed at Zahid, asking the girl to marry him, she wondered, was he really that worried about this? The wolf tried to convey that once she married him, they could live together. Rosie was surprised because all the priests who had conducted the experiments were wrong. It wasn't her fault. The beast simply needed the desire and effort to connect with her. The wolf continued talking about marriage, and Zahid looked at the girl in bewilderment, asking if she really understood what he was talking about. Rosie suddenly realized what he was talking about. Zahid added that he had never heard or seen anyone who could communicate with a divine beast. One way or another, he knew she lived in the temple. Judging from her documents, he assumed she was one of the temple's senior priests. After all, if her spiritual power was so strong. But our heroine abruptly cut off his assumptions, saying that it wasn't so. She was an ordinary student. If she had possessed sufficient spiritual strength, she simply wouldn't have left the temple. This topic had to be avoided because the boy thought that the temple was to blame for the death of his parents. On top of that, they were also trying to take the divine beast from him, and it was understandable that the boy hated them. Zahid assumed she was a spy sent by the temple. And yet our heroine knew that this kind of misunderstanding was very easy to resolve. The guy, perplexed, asked what she was doing, but the girl just asked to watch. Rosie began to emit energy, saying that it was all her spiritual energy and hoping that he could feel it. The guy was even more surprised because he really made sure that there wasn't that much of it. Rosie suddenly said she wished she had a little more spiritual strength. Then she could help Zahid overcome all the difficulties without the need for potions. Just at that moment, the guy realized what was happening and abruptly pulled his hand away, asking what made her think she could grab other people's hands. Rosie laughed and said that it was better to hold hands once than to continue to suspect her fiancé. And yet the guy blushed deeply, saying it was too close. Rosie suddenly started searching for something, saying that if they'd passed this stage, then she asked the boy to give her his left hand and immediately put the ring on his finger. Soon his hand even began to shake and he couldn't even speak. The girl replied that it was an engagement ring ordered from a magic tower. It adjusts to the wearer's size. That's why she advised him to stop staring at Shulba's bouquet since his gift was still worth more. The guy wanted to say something, but our heroine assured him that everything was fine, and she had already said that his fiancé had so much money that he should just accept the gift. He still wanted to express his indignation, but the girl placed her hand on his shoulder and thanked him for putting up with it until now. She wanted to come earlier, but that was all she could manage. Smiling, she told him that he had indeed been through a lot, but now she asked him to get a good rest. The wolf continued to be in matchmaker mode and barked, telling the newlyweds to finally get married. At this time, Ethan wrote down that Rosie was holding his hand, and he should have cut off the wrist of this fool, but he was afraid to do it himself, so he relied on Yulian. Just at that moment, Shulba approached the guy and snatched the notebook, saying that for the safety of the new owner, he needed to get rid of it. Ethan was perplexed as to how he could so easily side with this petty bully, but Shulba replied that he was just doing his job. He assumed that if Yulian saw everything that was there, he'd go crazy. At that moment, our heroine said goodbye and turned around. Passing Ethan, she said they had to go. There was one more place they needed to visit before returning home. The guy asked her in confusion what she was talking about, but there was a reason she took Ethan with her. The girl turned around saying they were going to the magic tower together. She suggested it would be great to speed up Ethan's progress toward becoming a great archmage. After some time, our heroine was with Ethan, and Shulba was talking with the new gentleman about the new staff, and that he would take care of them. The guy assumed that it would be better to replace everyone here, but perhaps there was someone in particular whom Zahid wanted to keep. In turn, the boy, angry at the whole world, said that he did not trust any of them. The people who came and assured him that he no longer had anything to worry about because they had already driven away, the bad people behaved even worse after that. That's why the boy said he didn't believe in rescuers or goodwill. He was too tired to trust anyone again. Shulba replied that this was a good approach because no one should be trusted for nothing, and it is right if he occupies a high position. The guy soon said he didn't believe the girl's words about liking him. She definitely had a motive. Shulba suggested that was quite likely. Zahid even thought this might be a plan since the Dyfenril family has many things they covet. Shulba reiterated that this was a well-founded suspicion. One way or another, the boy asked the assistant to know that he didn't trust him either because he didn't trust a man he saw for the first time in his life. At this point, Shulba was very surprised and soon decided that Mrs. Rosie had recommended a truly wonderful new job to him. He almost burst into tears because his previous boss was too trusting due to his past connections, which was burdensome. Shulba said that up until now he'd been treated as a friend, so it was exciting to be recognized solely for his abilities in this place. A very happy Shulba said that he would start work immediately, but he asked the gentleman to have a good rest. Soon after he left the boy alone after all this brainstorming. Leaning against fire, the boy said everything was fine. If Rosie hadn't lied to him, then the potion would arrive soon and he'd feel much better. He assumed that it would be better to sell himself for medicine than to sell himself for stable spiritual strength. The whole problem was that at first everyone came to him with a beaming smile, but after a while the masks began to slip from their faces no matter how much Zahid prayed that these smiles would not deceive him. Even knowing that this was not a solution, he simply endured because this was all he could do, and as if reading his thoughts, the boy suddenly realized he couldn't let himself be fooled again. Nort had much to gain from their union, so he couldn't trust the woman who had bribed the council into their engagement. And yet, even if that were so, he had to maintain this engagement until he came of age. The boy soon told Fire that this was all very strange. The wolf looked at his master in surprise. Zahid replied that he had definitely felt that the girl's spiritual strength was minimal, and he had checked it himself, but why did he want to sleep so much? Because of the pain that had been there all this time, he couldn't remember the last time he even slept normally. He wondered how he could fall asleep so calmly and peacefully while Rosie stood next to him in spirit, stroking him and asking him to have a good rest. After some time, our heroes were sitting in their carriage and Rosie could finally rest. Ethan looked at her, realizing that she was completely exhausted, so he had no idea how she was even going to visit the magic tower. He knew, of course, that Yulian had a younger sister whom he protected, but he couldn't have imagined that she would be so special. Rosie is very sweet, and when she smiles, she looks like the most innocent soul in the whole wide world. But when necessary, she becomes incredibly perceptive, because surviving in the Nort house is not so easy. So he was surprised. She is definitely not someone to be trifled with, and if you suddenly decide to treat her frivolously, you could get very badly burned. Even when she brazenly climbs into people's souls, there is still a strange warmth in her. To be honest, he's been feeling a bit strange ever since Rosie stood up for him. Perhaps he was simply jealous of her, as she had grown up surrounded by the love she received from Yulian, and Ethan believed that she knew how to repay it. Meanwhile, the boy grew up, and no one paid any attention to him. He was constantly bullied and told he was talentless. He thought it was only natural for him to live in fear and shadow, but despite the fact that even her origins were worse than his, Rosie continued to hold her head high. It was probably because of this that Ethan really liked this sweet side of the girl. Once again, Ethan began to look at Rosie, who was resting, but something was not very pleasant. The guy decided that the sun was shining too hard into her eyes, so he decided to close the curtains. It was precisely because of the noise that our heroine began to open her eyes and wake up to check what had happened. Literally that very second, she jumped up and started begging him not to do it. Ethan closed the curtains and looked at her in bewilderment. The girl cried and shook with fear, asking to be let out because she hates dark places. Soon the girl began to panic, which is why she began to scream and asked to be let out, but Ethan explained that it was dangerous because if she stood up, they could fall out. However, the girl threw Ethan's hand aside and said that she could not stay locked up any longer. Literally, a moment later, she was sitting and just screaming, and they almost turned over. The girl apologized for what was happening, but still begged for it all to stop. She rushed at the door and started knocking, asking to be let out of here because this was too unbearable. Ethan was no less scared at this point, which is why he began to get nervous and ask what happened to her. And yet soon our heroine was able to tear the curtains and the rays of the sun finally entered their carriage.